The Christmas Pact. Secret Valley Romance Book Number 3. Written by Cami Checketts. Narrated by Denver Checketts. Chapter 1. Allison Menendez followed her 3-year-old Joshua around the backyard as he shot his toy airsoft gun at bad guys, and she chatted with her sister. The leaves were changing and falling off her myriad of trees, and she needed to cut back more of her flowers that had frozen last night. It was almost the end of September, and had been a mild fall for their valley. The air was warm but crisp, and the smell was clean with a distinct moldy leaf smell. She loved fall, but it depressed her to think of losing her beautiful flower garden and being stuck throughout another vicious Secret Valley, Idaho winter. "Bam! Bam!" Josh screamed as he shot his gun. "Don't worry, Mama. You're safe. I got the bad guy." "Good job, love." He was so stinking cute. Maybe she shouldn't allow violence, but her boy had come out of the womb loving guns, military guys, and wrestling. At least airsoft pellets were harmless. "Are you talking to me or Josh?" Savannah asked. "Both of you," she shot back. Allison cradled the phone in the crook of her neck and scooped up some leaves with her other hand. Her sister Savannah was really on one today. Allison adored Savannah, but her little sister and Noah had been married all of a year now, and somehow that made her the expert on relationships. Allison had lost her first husband, Jonah, over 3 years ago in a small plane accident. Because of that heart-wrenching pain, not to mention losing her mother as a young college student, and the fear of more loss, she'd taken it slow dating Ryan. Ryan lived 4 hours away and traveled for work, so that had helped her to slow the relationship down. Almost 2 years was really slow though, and it was understandable that Ryan was antsy to get married. Ryan was her same age at 29, successful, handsome, and kind. She should be ecstatic that he loved her and her son so much. Sadly, she couldn't dredge up any excitement. "Ryan's coming to take me to dinner tonight at Essentials, and he asked me to dress up," she said to her sister. Finally admitting the reason she'd called this afternoon, she let the leaves flutter out of her hands. Savannah whistled. "You're in trouble, girl." Yep. Sadly, that's how she felt too. In trouble. Not like a woman who was probably getting engaged tonight should feel. When Jonah had asked her to marry him, she'd been ecstatic, but maybe her memory had rose-colored glasses. She'd been too young and naive to foresee an anguish and loneliness in store for her. Was that why she was afraid to marry Ryan? Fear of losing him? It felt more like fear of a lackluster life. "We've dated for over 2 years, and he's been so kind and devoted to me and Josh," she said to Savannah. "At this point, it's either get married or break his heart and break up." "Well then, shatter his heart and break up." "It's Rye. How can I break up with him after all this time and all he's done for me? It would devastate him." Allison knew it would. Her guilt was stronger than the fear of marrying for the wrong reasons. "I love Rye as much as you do, maybe more," Savannah said dryly. "But obviously it's not right if you think he's going to pop the question and your whole reason for marrying him is you've dated too long and he's too kind. That's dumb, sis. You should be ecstatic to marry him. You should want to spend every minute with him." "I enjoy being with him," Allison said. She did. Ryan was impressive, and he treated her and Josh like gold. What more could she want? Maybe some excitement to see him? To feel something when they touched or kissed? She tried, but lately it seemed even more lackluster when he kissed her, and she simply hoped it would be over quick. Maybe incredible kissing was only for teenagers, when every touch was a sparkle and trembling. "That's not enough," Savannah insisted. "You don't agree to get married because you feel guilty that you've dated too long." "Not everybody finds their Noah," she reminded her sister. Savannah and Noah were perfect for each other, and Allison swore she could feel the sparks of energy and love when she was around them. It was inspiring, and made her long to find something similar. "Are you trying to find another Jonah?" Her first husband's death had been traumatic. They'd had lots of sparks, attraction, and zing in their marriage, but they'd also fought far too much. Jonah had been a huge personality and very driven, as evidenced by his success as a facilitator for commercial real estate deals. He'd built her this beautiful house in this out-of-the-way valley he'd claimed was their paradise. She'd known they were doing well financially, but she'd been stunned when he passed, and she was not only the recipient of $5 million in life insurance, but also large monthly dividends from his many projects. Jonah had been great and impressive, but it had been exhausting to not only keep up with his energy and ideas, but to also be head over heels in love or ticked off all the time. Though Jonah had adored her, she'd lived in his shadow. Still, she ached for him and what they'd lost, and what her little boy had lost, not knowing his vivacious and engaging father. She and Ryan never fought. Never. If she disagreed with him on something, he backed down so quick she could hardly remember that he'd had an opinion in the first place. Couldn't there be balance, or was she fooling herself? A movement in the backyard next door caught her eye, and she blinked to see if it was her imagination. The image didn't change. Was there really a tall, dark, handsome man peeking at her from over the fence? How tall was the guy, or was he standing on something? She'd never seen so much as a scrap of their former neighbor's head over the fence. Their gazes met, and Allison sucked in a breath. His eyes were green, framed with dark lashes, and unique for his caramel brown skin, and they seemed to see right into her soul. He was not only ultra handsome, she'd never felt a connection like this before. She knew the Garrisons had sold their house and moved out last week. Was this her new neighbor? Wow. She'd have to take him and his most likely gorgeous wife some bread or cookies. And why did he look familiar somehow? She'd remember if she'd ever met such an appealing, captivating, and gargantuan man before, right? Allie? Savannah questioned. Bad guy, Josh yelled, only a few feet away from the man. No, Allison cried out as Josh pulled the trigger on his airsoft gun and tagged the man right in the cheek. The guy yelped in surprise. I got you, Josh gloated. I've got to go, Allison managed, shoving the phone into her pocket and running for her son before he shot the man again. The pellets had never hurt anyone, but a shot that close to the face would sting. How could she begin to apologize? This was an awful way to start a relationship with the new neighbors. Josh was indeed aiming at the man again when Allison reached him. She yanked the gun from his small grasp. Mama, he protested. I'm protecting you from the bad guy. He tilted his chin up. Hey, bad guy. Luckily, Josh knew no fear and didn't remember the real-life bad guy who'd attacked Allison last year. Those memories kept Allison from sleeping well at night. That was another reason to marry Ryan. She wouldn't be alone and afraid any longer. The man released his cheek, which had a small red welt on it, and then he laughed. His laughter made Allison freeze. It was rich, deep, and irresistible. Was he really laughing when he could curse them and threaten to sick his dog on them or sue or something? Hey, the man lifted a hand. Is this how you welcome a new guy to the neighborhood? I am so sorry, Allison began. No worries. It's a toy and he was protecting you. He smiled easily and looked down at Josh. Do you want to see something I think you'll really like? Josh shrugged his thin shoulders. Sure. The man held up a finger. I'll be right back. He turned and disappeared behind the myriad of trees in his backyard. Allison dropped to her knees, set Josh's toy pistol on the ground, and took his shoulders in her hands. You can't just go around shooting people. Remember how you have to have eye protection if you're having a war with Noah, Jason, or Ryan? His large dark eyes got somber. I forgot. Sorry, Mama. He kicked at some leaves and dropped his chin to his chest. Did I hurt the bad guy? She hated seeing him cowed, but he shouldn't be allowed to shoot anyone he saw with his airsoft pistol. It looked like it hurt. Luckily, he seems like a nice guy, and he laughed when he could have gotten mad. She released his shoulders and lifted his chin with her fingers. Let's call our new neighbor a nice guy, not a bad guy, love. A very handsome, very tall, somehow familiar nice guy. Was he married? Why did she care? She was getting engaged tonight. That thought settled in her gut like a rock. Oh, Josh nodded his understanding. He's a nice guy. I gotcha. I only shoot bad guys, except for a war. She smiled. He was so adorable and reminded her so much of a mini Jonah, full of life and happiness. It was hard for her to reprimand him. Her dad and Noah were great influences for him, but he really needed a solid male figure in his life, like Ryan. Her shoulders rounded, and the rock in her stomach grew into a boulder. She needed to marry Ryan for Josh, but was that fair to her or Ryan? Footsteps crunched through the leaves in the yard next door. Allison scrambled to her feet and swept Josh into her arms. You need to say sorry, she whispered against his cheek. I beg, Mom. I got this. She laughed. The man reached the gate between their backyards and paused. May I? Allison appreciated him asking. Their small northeastern Idaho valley didn't see much crime, but Wesley Richens had knocked Allie down the stairs last year and put her in a coma. Now, despite the amped-up security system Noah and his buddy Jason had installed, and both claimed was top of the line, and bear spray by her bed and in closets and cupboards, sometimes at night she still trembled at weird noises. Sure, she said, clinging to Josh. Too much love, Mama, Josh protested. Sorry. She relaxed her grip. The man opened the gate and strode through, holding a case of some sort with his right hand and a grocery sack in his left. He was taller than she'd realized, probably even taller than Noah's 6'4". His arms were lean and striated, the muscles popping as he carried his load. Definitely an athlete of some sort. Is that why he looked familiar? What was he doing in Secret Valley? Whoa, you're a big guy, Josh said. He smiled and set down his load, extending his hand to Josh first. So I'm a big guy, not a bad guy now. Josh put out his small hand and solemnly shook the large brown palm of the much larger man. I'm sorry, big guy. Mama says you're a nice guy. I won't shoot you again. Not in the face, at least. Thanks, he grinned, and hollow dimples appeared on his smooth cheeks. Oh boy, she was in trouble. She'd never seen a man outside of a movie screen as appealing as this one. Was he an actor? Maybe that was why he was familiar and irresistibly handsome. He released Josh's hand and held his large palm out to her. I'm Vaughn Tabane. She froze and stared at him. Vaughn Tabane? The basketball superstar? Standing in her backyard? It was surreal, incredible and thrilling. She'd seen him play on television, and once in person when her dad had taken her and Josh to a game. She'd heard her dad, Noah, Jason, and Ryan discussing how incredible he was, and bemoaning how he shouldn't have retired last season. They philosophized it had to do with losing both his parents last year before Christmas, marrying the gorgeous actress Tylee Hammond shortly after, and then divorcing her for irreconcilable differences. Not 2 months later. His dad had been Polynesian and his mom was black. Vaughn perfectly combined both of his heritages. He was incredible and impressive, and he was seriously standing in front of her. Oh my, you really are Vaughn Tabane, she muttered. He chuckled at that, his hand still out. Mama, Josh said in a stage whisper, don't leave the nice guy hanging. Allison set Josh on the ground and extended her hand. Their hands slid together in a soft, slow, tantalizing movement before he wrapped his fingers around her hand, engulfing her smaller palm. Tingles shot up her arm. It was insane, and probably just because he was famous and handsome and all the men in her life were enthralled with him. His green eyes darted to their hands, then back up to meet her gaze. He seemed as stunned by the connection as she was. He slowly edged closer to her, and the warm yet spicy smell of his cologne competed with a sharp sense of fall. He was at least a foot taller than her, so she arched her head back to hold his gaze. It didn't seem too much of a discrepancy as he leaned down. If he kept leaning and she went on tiptoes and threw her arms around his neck, she could kiss him without much effort. Kissing him would be no effort at all. It would be sheer pleasure. Mama? Josh said from below. Allison yanked her hand back and brushed at her dark hair, attempting nonchalance but probably failing. As soon as the connection severed, guilt rushed through her. She was in a committed relationship with an amazing man and was probably getting engaged tonight. What was she doing sharing a connection and sparks and wanting to go on tiptoes and lock lips with some stranger? Yet she'd done nothing wrong. She'd shaken a man's hand for heaven's sake, but she'd had some crazy errant thoughts. Somehow she had to squash this attraction. Vaughn gave her an alluring smile and then squatted down on Josh's level and said, Do you want to see my gun? Yeah, man, Josh cheered, putting out his fist. Vaughn bumped his knuckles and then opened the box he'd set down. Nestled inside, next to packets of bronze-colored BBs and aerosol canisters of some sort, was a black gun that looked like the automatic machine guns Allison had seen on television. Whoa! Josh jumped up and down. Can I touch it? Allison sucked in a breath and hurried to grab her son. I'm not comfortable with this, she said quickly to Vaughn. Noah and his close friend Jason had both worked for the sheriff's department, hunted with rifles, and carried pistols most of the time. But Allison knew and trusted them. She'd never seen either of them with a machine gun. Oh, Vaughn shook his head, looking up at her from his semi-squatting position. It's a BB gun. Look. He closed the box and straightened again. holding the entire package up so she could see a bunch of words on the outside of the box. But most importantly, SBR full auto BB gun. Allison's breath rushed out and she gave an uneasy laugh. Oh, a BB gun. It looks so real. I guess you can show him your BB gun. He winked and squatted down next to Josh again. The two of them struck up an immediate friendship. Vaughn showed him how he loaded the gun each time he fired it. He explained that the CO2 in the canisters lasted for a while, but he had to refill it with CO2 far more often than he wanted to. Josh listened with rapt attention and then helped him set up a few pop cans from the grocery sack he'd brought. Josh stepped back to stand next to Allison as Vaughn lifted the gun to his shoulder. The burst of bullets and pop cans being shredded and knocked over made Allison jump, and Josh laughed with glee. Again! Josh screamed. Vaughn grinned and loaded the gun, and then fired another round. It was crazy how fast it ran out of bullets. Woohoo! Josh cheered. Mama, can I get one for Christmas? Santa will bring me one, right? No way was she buying her son an automatic BB gun. His airsoft pistol was plenty dangerous. What if he'd hit Vaughn in the cheek with that gun? Vaughn would probably have permanent damage. You want to shoot it? Vaughn asked Josh, saving her from having to tell Josh no on the BB gun. Yes, yes, yes. Josh punched a fist in the air and ran to Vaughn. If that's all right with you, Vaughn asked. She nodded uncertainly. If you'll help him. Of course. Vaughn got the gun ready again. It seemed like a lot of work for a half a second of bullets to rush out. Then he patiently showed Josh how to line up the sights. The gun was too large, so Vaughn put the butt of the gun over Josh's shoulder and helped him steady the gun. Vaughn held on to her son and the gun as Josh pulled the trigger. A volley of bullets missed the pop cans completely, dinging into a tree. Yay! Josh yelled out. Did I hit them? Luckily, they hadn't traded out the pop cans, or he wouldn't have believed Vaughn's gracious answer of, I think you nicked some. You want to try again? Yes. He looked at her and added, Please? Vaughn grinned, and they worked together to load and fire the thing over and over again. Josh got better and hit the pop cans repeatedly. Allison loved watching them together, their dark heads bent together. The way Josh lit up as Vaughn complimented him or when he shot the gun. The large, handsome man and her small, adorable boy was a beautiful picture. She debated pulling out her phone and snapping a picture of them together. She blinked and startled. What was she thinking? She was 98% certain that Ryan was going to ask her to marry him tonight, and 91% certain she was going to say yes, no matter what Savvy thought. Ryan was incredible, wholly devoted to her and Josh, and she'd been an idiot to not marry him. Why, then, was she loving the image of this stranger and her boy together? Ryan was amazing with Josh, and Josh adored him, thought of him as a father already. Her thoughts scattered when Vaughn looked at her and asked with a slight smirk on his full, appealing, too beautiful lips, Do you want to shoot it? She backed up a step. No, I'm fine. You and Josh have fun. Josh bounced up and down. Mama, shoot it. Then you'll want to buy me one so bad. She arched her eyebrows at Vaughn. I blame you, she said. He already had a gun obsession. Now it's going to be a mania. He chuckled. Come and try it. Fine. She walked to them. Josh backed up, clapping and grinning. You got this, Mama. Vaughn refilled the BBs and then rested the gun in her hands. His larger palms brushed hers, and she had to fight to ignore that odd, warm, incredible tingling sensation. He eased behind her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, supporting her hands on the gun and making her quiver. He was so tall and muscular she felt surrounded, protected, and on fire from his touch. What was happening? What was he doing getting so familiar? What was she doing not only allowing it, but loving the sensation? She should tell him to back off. She couldn't find her tongue to talk at all. He leaned down, and his breath brushed her hairline as he explained, Hold it level, and you can sight in the target. She tried to listen and squeezed one eye shut as she sighted in the pop cans, but her hands were trembling so badly she couldn't hold it level. Vaughn chuckled softly, and she wasn't sure if he was laughing at her or if he simply enjoyed knowing that he affected her. He could easily tell that, right? Josh could probably tell. Dang, she was in trouble. His chest pressed against the top of her back and shoulders, and her head rested perfectly in the crook of his neck. His arms tightened around her as he held her hands and the gun steady. The world around them disappeared. There was only Vaughn and his nicely muscled arms and chest, making her feel safe, and full of tingles, and his warm, spicy scent, and his even warmer breath against her forehead as he bent his head down. If she turned her head slightly and arched on tiptoes, their lips would line up. What would it be like to kiss a man like this? Her imagination ran wild, and she knew it would be the kiss of a lifetime. Was it wrong to deny herself such a pleasure before getting engaged to Ryan and sharing boring kisses for the rest of her life? "Shoot it, Mama!" Josh cheered, thankfully pulling her away from her crazy thoughts. Had she really been imagining kissing him for the second time since she'd met him? So what if this man was famous, handsome, and irresistible? She was in a committed relationship. Heaven help her. Vaughn's grip on her tightened. Somebody help her. "You got this," Vaughn whispered against her head. She blew out a breath and focused on the target, and with him holding her steady, she held down the trigger. The gun bucked against her shoulder, and the ding of the pop cans being hit made Josh cheer. A clicking sounded, indicating the bullets were out, and Vaughn whispered, "Good job." Allison released the trigger, but she couldn't catch a breath with him so near. She needed to get out of his arms and away from him if she was going to resist him, far away, like in Texas, maybe. No, South Africa. Leaving his perfect arms was the last thing her physical body wanted to do, but thankfully her brain and spirit were stronger, if only marginally so at the moment. She yanked away and spun to face him, pulling in and pushing out uneven breaths as she clung to the gun. He smiled softly, his green eyes full of her. It looked like he knew exactly how much he was affecting her, and he liked it. She knew nothing about this man except he was famous, an incredible athlete, and had been married to an A-list actress, had lost his charitable-minded parents, funded multiple charities, was cute with her son, and was irresistibly handsome. Okay, she knew a lot about him for being around him only 20 minutes, but still, he wasn't Ryan, and she wasn't committed to him. And guaranteed, women flung themselves at this guy's feet. She wasn't some famous man groupie. She was a responsible, rational, settled in her life mother. "Mama, are you okay?" Josh asked. "You're breathing like Darth Vader." He imitated the loud, panting breaths of Vader. Heat filled her face, and Vaughn's smile grew. "We need to go," she said sharply, shoving the gun into Vaughn's hands, careful not to let their hands brush. "It's nap time." Josh cocked his head at her, and then shook it. "No, it's not. I already had my nap." Allison rolled her eyes at herself. "I'm sorry. I meant chore time." "Mama," Josh pushed out her name like a huffy teenager. "I did my chores already this day." "Reading time?" she squeaked out, as Vaughn's green gaze got somehow darker, more irresistible, and more knowing. "We read before naps, and we'll read again at dark time," Josh reminded her. He talked well for a 3-year-old, spending most of his time with adults, but right now she felt like her son was the adult and she was the 3-year-old. "Snack time," she declared. "And we're making cookies." Josh loved treats probably more than guns. "Yay!" Josh punched a fist in the air and raced back towards the house. He turned back quick, ran back, picked up his airsoft pistol, hugged Vaughn fiercely around the legs, and yelled, "Thanks for shooting guns." "Any time," Vaughn said smoothly, with more charm than any man deserved to have. Ryan. Picture Ryan's face. Ryan was smoothly good looking. Ryan was kind and pleasant to be around. She dated him for 2 years. She should love him. She was determined to marry him. Why couldn't she picture his face? Josh looked up at her. "Mama, can Vaughn make cookies with us?" Vaughn and Josh both stared at her with appealing gazes. One of those looks would have been torture to resist, but their combined power was crippling. "No," she said too sharply. Proud she'd pushed the correct word out instead of begging Vaughn to spend every spare minute with them. "Mr. Tabane is busy moving in. Very busy. Too busy." Vaughn grinned like she'd said out loud that he was messing with her brain, and she wanted to throw herself at his feet like all those other women probably did. "I'm not," he said softly. "I'd never be too busy for the two of you." Fire rushed through her. He wasn't too busy for them? He'd never be too busy for them? Oh my. She shook her head. "I'm sorry. No. We've got to make the cookies quick, and then Mama has her big date tonight with Ryan, and Noah and Savvy are coming to eat pizza with you." She was talking to Josh, but couldn't peel her eyes from Vaughn. "Yay for Ryan, Uncle Noah, Auntie Savvy, and pizza!" Josh cheered. He looked up at Vaughn, sobering. "Sorry you can't have cookies or pizza. When Mama says no, we have to listen, or Papa will kick our bums." Allison had never seen her father even discipline Josh, but she'd appreciated he was trying to teach Josh to obey her. No worries, man. Vaughn extended his fist, and Josh bumped it. I'll see you tomorrow. All right. Josh jumped and cheered and ran for the house. Allison stared at Vaughn. See him tomorrow? What? They weren't starting some relationship here. They would be cordial neighbors. Maybe she'd bring him cookies someday. That was more than enough. She tilted her chin up. Thank you again. If you'll excuse me. Vaughn strode up to her. She froze as she watched him approach. He was big. He was powerful. He was beautiful. He was breathtaking. He reached her and stared at her for several incredible seconds. Then he said softly, Breathe. Allison gasped for air. What was he doing to her? His gaze swept over her face, then locked in on her eyes, and she couldn't have looked away unless Josh was in danger. I agree with your friend on the phone, he said softly. If your options are to break up or get married, break up with him. If it's not right, getting married will only make the situation worse and cause more pain. She couldn't look away from him. Was he speaking from experience of his highly publicized failed marriage? She wanted to know more, ask him about his life and his advice. Wait a minute. What right did he have to give her advice? He didn't know her or Ryan or their situation. It was right. Marrying Ryan was right. She should repeat that 100 times, and maybe she wouldn't want to beg Vaughn Tabane to keep staring into her eyes. Mama, please come. Cookies, Josh called from the back patio. I've got to go, she murmured, though she hated the thought of walking away from him. She wanted to stay right here, looking up into his incredible gaze and finding out all about him. He only nodded, still studying her. Allison backed away and then spun and broke into a jog. She needed to get away from that man and whatever crazy power he had over her. So he was handsome, wealthy, well-known, and adorable with Josh. He wasn't Ryan, and she hadn't invested 2 years into a relationship with him. Something told her if she spent 2 days in a relationship with Vaughn, she'd be more invested than she'd ever been in her life. Dumb. That was dumb. She'd been married to Jonah, an incredible man, and would get engaged to Ryan, another incredible man, tonight. Vaughn Tabane, legendary and handsome, could handle a basketball? Who cared? He meant nothing to her. Despite that fact, she looked over her shoulder before she ushered Josh into the house, and quivered with pleasure when she found him still watching her, his gaze full of her and everything about him far too alluring. Chapter 2. Allison was an absolute mess. She and Josh made chocolate chip cookies together, destroying her formerly clean kitchen in the process, and somehow getting dough in her hair. She had no clue how Josh accomplished that, but it could have been her fault. Her brain was stuck out in the backyard with Vaughn Tabane staring into her eyes. She had to keep reminding herself that it wasn't reality. Ryan was reality. When she looked at the clock and realized it was 5:30, she screamed, slid into her prettiest dress, a red, sparkly fitted, sleeveless, floor-length dress she'd only worn on a cruise with Jonah once. She immediately flipped out that she was overdressed and she didn't have the right shoes or a jacket, sweater, or wrap that would work. Why hadn't she thought of this earlier? Maybe because a certain irresistible neighbor blew her mind this afternoon. Thankfully, Josh knew how to tell Siri to call Savvy, and her sister promised she had the perfect shoes and wrap. The doorbell rang, and Josh sprinted out of her room for the door. Savvy, and normally so would Ryan. Maybe he wanted tonight to feel more formal? Or what if it was Vaughn? Allison grabbed her clutch, shoved some lip gloss and her cell phone in, and ran as fast as she could in the form-fitting dress down the stairs. Josh flung the door open, which he'd been instructed not to do, but he was obviously as excited as she was. Rye, he called out happily, flinging himself against Ryan's legs. Allison stopped on the stairs. She shouldn't be so disappointed, but it not being Vaughn made her stomach fill with lead. Ryan was dressed in a dark gray suit and a yellow tie, and looked very handsome. He was a tall, appealing man. Not as tall or appealing as Vaughn, a voice in her head taunted. Was it Savannah's voice? Was she really hearing voices? Hey! Ryan swept Josh off the floor and easily tossed him in the air. Josh squealed and laughed. Rye guy! How's my tough guy? I missed you. Ryan gave Josh a hug. Allison's heart squeezed. Ryan was the best. He truly loved Josh like his own. He'd seen her through hard times and been so patient. When she was in the hospital last year, he'd refused to leave her side. He'd treated her and Josh like gold. Vaughn Tabane? She didn't even know the superstar. It was absolutely idiotic to risk her relationship with Ryan over some doubts, lackluster kisses, and some crazy interaction with her new neighbor. Tingles were for high schoolers. This was real life. Allison forced her legs to move down the stairs and toward her future. Was she having an out-of-body experience? Everything happened quickly, but she didn't feel part of it. Savannah rushed in from the garage entry, with Noah following more sedated. Ryan looked Allison over appreciatively, kissed her while still holding Josh, and told her repeatedly how beautiful she was. Savannah handed over the shoes and wrap. Allison finished dressing, kissed her family goodbye, and was in the car with Ryan and then at the restaurant before she could blink. She vaguely remembered making shallow conversation about Ryan's latest trip, buying cars in Arizona, and how it was still too hot there despite it being the end of September. She remembered him asking about Jason and Brittany Pearl, and telling him they were indeed married and living up the canyon, and they'd come by this weekend. She remembered ordering water, a salad, salmon, and veggies, and thanking the server. She remembered eating the delicious food. She remembered Ryan's gaze never leaving her, and saying she was beautiful so many times she wanted to tell him to stop. As a strawberry cheesecake was placed in front of her, she managed a few bites and then pushed it away, murmuring that she was full. Ryan stared intently at her, and then slid back from his chair, came around, and knelt in front of her. He took both of her hands in his. Everything suddenly came into focus. The conversation next to them was too loud. Her stomach churned from dinner, or maybe from something she didn't want to name. Ryan's hands were clammy. His smile seemed forced as hers felt. She yanked her hands free, shoved her chair back from the intimate table, and managed, "I need to use the restroom." Ryan stood and nodded tightly, obviously not pleased that she had interrupted the moment. She walked away, mincing steps in the tight dress and 2 high heels, yet she finally felt like she could draw in a full breath. Her head was clear now, too clear. How on earth had she gotten here? 2 years dating this great guy. The time had gone fast, and there had been no red flags or reasons to break up. But now she felt like she had no choice but to say yes. Marriage was a huge deal. Should she start a marriage out of guilt? Was she ready to be married again? Some days she still ached for Jonah and cried at what they'd lost. Maybe a miracle would happen and Ryan wouldn't propose. He'd been down on both knees. Wasn't it just one knee? What did it matter? She wasn't escaping this. Her throat tightened. Unless she ran away from the restaurant. She'd left her clutch with her phone on the table. Dang it. She'd have to go back there eventually. Secret Valley was small. If she walked down Main Street for a while, somebody she knew would probably stop and give her a ride. What was wrong with her? She had to calm down and be walking toward the bathroom. She skirted past the hostess station and turned toward the hallway for the bathrooms. A large, dark-haired man entered the front doors, approached the hostess station, and caught her eye. She startled and stopped in her tracks. Vaughn. He was reaching for a bag of takeout with one hand and handing his credit card to the hostess with his other hand. Allison gasped and backed away quickly. His gaze swung toward her, and his eyes widened in shock and then filled with appreciation. He left the takeout and his credit card at the hostess counter and strode in her direction. Allison hurried down the hallway, almost tripping on Savannah's 3-inch heels. This could not be happening to her. She was supposed to focus on Ryan. She needed to go back to that table, let him propose, and then kiss him. When they kissed as an engaged couple, knowing soon they would be intimate as a married couple, would that spark desire in her? It should, right? She loved intimacy with Jonah, and should be excited to be with Ryan in that way. She tried to imagine it, but it made her even more nauseous. How was Vaughn here? At this very wrong moment? She ran into a wall and stopped. Vaughn slowed his steps and then stopped a foot away. "Allison," he said warmly, "you look incredible." "Thank you," she managed. He looked better than incredible in a short-sleeved white golf-type shirt and navy blue pants, but she wasn't about to tell him that. Did he have his clothes tailor-made to fit his tall, well-built frame? He must, to have his clothing fit that perfectly. Who cared about Vaughn Tebaine's clothes? She was getting engaged to Ryan, tonight, probably. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. He grinned. "Picking up takeout. This restaurant has the best reviews on Google." He took a couple steps closer, and she could smell that warm, spicy scent. She still had to look up to hold his gaze, but the distance between them had shrunk. It was the Spike Hills. Who cared? She cared. He was the perfect height for her. "Maybe if my friendly neighbor would go to dinner with me tomorrow, I could try out your favorite local spot." Allison shook her head quickly, managing to spit out, "I'm not available tomorrow." He rested his hand on the wall next to her head. She'd seen the move in movies before. The effect in person was 1,000 times more incredible and brought them even closer together. Next night, I'd love to have my buddy Josh come with us as well. Allison drew several quick breaths. She couldn't think straight with him so close, smelling and looking so good. I'm getting engaged tonight, she burst out with the only defense she had. She planted both palms on Vaughn's chest, intent on pushing him away, but a surprised gasp left her lips. Oh my, she murmured. She never felt anything quite like this before. His chest muscles were beautifully formed, and they felt really good under her hands. She asked, more to herself than anything. His smile became far too confident. He kept one hand on the wall behind her and used the other to gently trail his fingers down her cheek and along her jawline before cupping the back of her neck. She trembled in response and held her breath in anticipation, slowly arching up toward him. Breathe, he reminded her in a husky whisper. She gasped for air but couldn't make herself move away. Engaged? He asked softly, his eyes flickering to her lips and back to meet her gaze. She was burning clear through. She was going to melt into a puddle at his feet. No, his powerful arms would hold her up. Would it be too forward to ask him to wrap her up in those muscular arms and pull her tight against his beautiful chest? Allison had no clue what he'd just said and why. Engaged, she repeated dumbly. She wasn't engaged. You're getting engaged tonight, he reminded her, leaning closer until his warm, peppermint-scented breath brushed her lips. Ryan. Oh my crap, I am. She somehow regained her senses, pushed at his chest, and then ducked under his arm. He straightened and turned to her, as appealing and perfect as any man she'd ever met. She had to stay strong, for Ryan, for herself, for Josh. She pointed a shaky finger at him. You need to stay away from me. I'm getting engaged tonight to the right man for me. You're just some famous, handsome dude that women hurl themselves at. I'm not one of those women. Got it? His brows knit together. Of course you're not. You are an incredible, impressive lady, the most appealing and real woman I've ever met. His voice deepened. I would really like to get to know you better, Allison. No, stop, she begged. Then she childishly put her hands over her ears. She took them away and pointed at him, her entire arm trembling. I'm not one of your female followers who swoons at a glance and a compliment from the superstar. I'm a mother, a widow, and in a committed relationship with a great man who I am going to marry someday. Excuse me. Vaughn's gaze looked sad. Heartbreakingly sad. He didn't reach out to her or say anything. He simply nodded. She was 2 steps away when he said quietly, I hope you're making the right choice. Forever is the wrong thing to be wrong about. She felt like he'd smacked her upside the head. She wanted to stop and ask him to explain exactly what he meant by that, but she couldn't let herself. She marched down the hallway, back to the table, and to Ryan. Ryan stood, smiling uncertainly at her. He took both of her hands in his and went to one knee, obviously anxious to get this out before she ran off again. Allie, I love you. I had a whole speech written up about how much you mean to me and all we've been through together, but looking at you, my brain is scattered. You're so beautiful and perfect for me. All that matters is that we're together. Please marry me and make me the happiest man in the world. He released one of her hands and drew a ring box from his suit jacket, smoothly popping it open. Allison's stomach churned as she looked from his handsome, expectant face to the ring box. Smooth, white gold band framed a massive, princess-cut diamond. It was gorgeous. She should shout yes, kiss him, let him slide this beautiful ring onto her finger. Her mouth flopped open, but nothing came out. Her eyes beelined to a certain someone who was also watching them. Vaughn stood next to the hostess stand, holding the bag of takeout. His green gaze seemed to beg her to give him a chance. Forever is the wrong thing to be wrong about. Who said crap like that? This wasn't about her and Vaughn or any of Vaughn's opinions. Tonight, her future was about her and Ryan. She wouldn't be lonely for Jonah any longer, or scared of being alone at night. Josh would have a father, a great father. She'd have a friend and companion. This was right. Ryan was the best. She had to say yes. She wrenched her gaze from Vaughn's and looked down at Ryan. He stood slowly and wrapped one arm around her waist, holding onto the ring box with his other hand. Allie? She blinked at him, and to her horror, tears streamed down her cheeks. His gaze widened, as if he could sense those weren't happy tears. I'm so sorry, she rushed out, stunned what was coming out of her mouth. Sorry? His eyes searched her face. I can't marry you. I just can't. I'm so terribly sorry. She was sobbing now. Had she truly told Ryan no? After 2 years of him proving he was the most patient, kind, and incredible man on this planet, Josh would sob harder than she was right now if Ryan disappeared from his life. What was she doing? What was she thinking? How could she make this right? She met Ryan's gaze and could see how hard her refusal had hit him. He released her and shut the ring box, stowing it back in his suit coat. Pulling out some cash, he dumped a wad of bills on the table, then wrapped his arm around her again, softly, kindly, just as he did everything. Let's get out of here, he murmured. We can talk about this at home. Okay, she managed, through her tears, though she knew there was nothing to talk about. She and Ryan were through. It made her heart wrench in two, but it was the most freeing feeling she had in 2 years. He escorted her past the tables and toward the exit. They passed the hostess table, and her gaze collided with Vaughn's. She half expected him to gloat, but he looked as somber and heartbroken as she felt, almost as if he'd been here himself, and he cared deeply for her and didn't want her to go through the same pain. Ryan kept her moving, and finally they were outside in the fall evening air. The tears didn't stop coming. Ryan settled her into the car, then walked around to the driver's side. He said nothing as they drove home. They walked into her house, and Noah greeted them. How was dinner? Fine, Ryan managed through a thin smile. Allison gave Noah a desperate look. His gaze darted between the two of them, and realization kicked in quickly. Getting Josh in his PJs. I'll go check on them. He jogged through the entryway and up the stairs. Allison turned to face Ryan. This hurt, but she was relieved she'd been able to do it. She couldn't go back. She couldn't marry him. And though she was frustrated at Vaughn, he and Savannah were right. Marriage wasn't something she should commit to out of guilt or obligation. I'm so sorry, Rye, she said miserably. He held up a hand, his dark eyes searching hers. Please stop apologizing. This isn't your fault. It is, she said. I should have broken up with you a long time ago. But you've been so great, fabulous truly, and Josh loves you. There was never any reason to break up, so I just kept wasting your time. I didn't mean to. He shook his head, mouth twisting. Josh loves me, but you don't? She felt even worse. She'd told him she loved him, as a response almost every time he'd told her. When it came down to it, she didn't love him enough. I love you like a close friend, she admitted. There aren't any sparks between us. I would be marrying you out of obligation. He flinched and then muttered, I understand. Silence fell between them. She felt like she should keep apologizing, but it wouldn't help him feel any better. He was such a nice guy. Of course he didn't get mad at her. He simply looked as miserable as she felt. After a few beats, he asked, Can I say goodbye to Josh? She put a hand on her stomach. This was going to kill Josh. Thankfully, he was young enough that he probably wouldn't remember or have lasting damage. She nodded to Ryan. He turned from her and walked up the stairs. She heard a low murmur of voices, and then Noah and Savannah came downstairs. They both stared at her as if shocked she hadn't simply gone along with the marriage proposal. She tilted her head to the side, and the three of them walked out onto the porch. Noah softly shut the door and leaned against it, holding his arms across his broad chest. You okay? Allison shook her head, the tears rushing out again. It was horrible, but I took your advice. She pinned Savannah with a look. For some petty reason, she wanted to shift the blame to Savannah. You can't get married out of guilt. You would be miserable, and so would Ryan. He can't see that now, but he will someday. Allison just let the tears come and held on to her sister. She felt big arms come around them both and managed a watery smile up at Noah. He was huge and such a great guy. His blue eyes were full of compassion and understanding as he nodded to her. It hit her that he was a little thicker but not as tall as Vaughn. Then she got mad at herself for even thinking about Vaughn, and she snuck a look at his house. Thankfully, he wasn't out on the porch watching her. The front door opened behind them, and they pulled apart. Ryan shook Noah's hand, and they did the manly backslapping thing. Then he gave Savannah a long hug. Savannah and Noah both murmured goodbyes, and then they slipped back into the house. Allison faced Ryan once again. His dark eyes were somber, but not angry. She'd never seen him angry. Some lucky lady would be thrilled to marry him someday. But she could hardly tell him that. It would sound like an empty platitude, and he'd hate that. "Thank you for being so wonderful, to me and to Josh," she said. He nodded, clenching his hands into fists. "When Josh asks about me, please tell him he's the best little boy ever." His voice broke, and he studied her porch railing. She felt horrible. "Please tell him I didn't want to leave him." "I will," she said. "I'll explain that this wasn't your choice." He met her gaze again, his dark eyes bright. "I love that kid." Allison's heart broke. She'd known this would be nightmarishly hard, and that was exactly why she'd waited until it came to a head like this before dealing with it. This was worse than hard. It was horrific. "He loves you too." Ryan's gaze trailed over her face, as if memorizing it. "If you ever change your mind, oh no, please don't let him go there." "I'll never stop loving you," he said, the last words more fiercely than any of her life. She should just cave and marry him. This wasn't fair to him or Josh. She didn't respond at all, because she had no clue how to. Ryan wrapped her up and held her close. She clung to him and cried as hard as she had at the restaurant. Finally he eased back, kissed each of her cheeks, and then tenderly kissed her mouth. Then he pulled away and strode to his car as if the hounds of Hades were chasing him. Allison deflated against the door as she watched him go. She slowly made her way back inside and said goodnight and thank you to Noah and Savvy. Crazily enough, even Savannah seemed to have nothing to say. Allison deadbolted the door leading into the garage behind them. They'd used the keypad to shut the garage from the outside. She walked slowly through her house and trudged up the stairs. "Mama?" Josh called from his room. Oh crap, he wasn't asleep. How could she face him like this? She walked into his room and saw his cute face illuminated by the nightlight. As soon as he saw her, he popped up, standing on his toddler bed and opening his arms. "Where's my Rye guy?" Allison had thought her tear ducts were depleted, but her vision went watery again. She took off her heels and climbed onto Josh's bed and held him close. She managed one-word answers as he prattled about Ryan and all the fun things they did together. Finally he drifted off to sleep. She lay there, taking comfort from her baby in her arms, and crying for what she'd lost. The only misery she could compare this to was when her mom and Jonah had each died. Chapter 3. Vaughn had a miserable night. He was worried about Allison and Josh and felt like a grade A jerk, as if he'd caused her heartache. He'd been speaking from experience with his failed marriage and thought he was helping her, but maybe he'd only been acting selfish because he wanted Allison and Josh for himself. He'd never been around someone as real and appealing as Allison. Her spirit seemed to shine, and she'd drawn him in from the moment he'd first saw her, and Josh was hilarious and cute. Vaughn simply wanted more time with them. He should have stayed out of it. He'd been a cocky jerk as a teenager, and his parents had worked hard to help him find faith in the Savior and learn to not be a selfish, overly competitive athlete. His parents had been the grounding force in his life. When he'd lost them, it had challenged his faith. He'd been mourning his parents' deaths when he'd met Tylee through a friend. She seemed perfect, and during the short time they dated, her sparkle and shine had replaced the loneliness and ache he'd felt. But the moment he'd said, "I do," everything had changed. His marriage to Tylee had been miserable from the moment they'd exchanged vows. Even though they eloped to the Grand Cayman and were in a tropical paradise, she became controlling, mean, and straight up crazy. When they divorced 2 months later, she got a huge settlement because he'd been too dopey to even make her sign a prenup. He'd found out later from a friend who'd overheard her bragging about it that Tylee had schemed the entire thing. She'd wanted his money and the attention marrying and then divorcing him would bring. She made incredible money on her own, but blew through it like water. Vaughn shook his head, trying to clear the terrible memories of the paparazzi stalking him, but that was preferable to the purgatory his life had been while married to Tylee. After his divorce, he'd focused on his faith, basketball, and trying to be the kind of man his mom and dad would want him to be. Not the alpha male who had to be the top dog all the time. He put on a t-shirt, shorts, socks, and running shoes, downed a pre-workout and headed outside. He ran straight up the small canyon not far from his house, slowing to a hike as he climbed up the switchbacks on the south side. The leaves were changing colors, and many had already fallen. He absolutely loved this gorgeous valley and was stoked to experience 4 seasons. Living most of his life in Southern California, focusing on basketball year-round, and growing up with very little money, he'd never seen a white Christmas. He'd retired from basketball at the end of last season. He'd given his team his very best, as he always tried to do, but losing his parents and then being married and divorced had taken its toll on him. He wanted to be around down-to-earth people. He'd asked his personal assistant to get the best realtor in the nation and find him a small, quiet valley with all the seasons and a house in a Leave It to Beaver kind of neighborhood. He wanted to retire in Happy Valley. It had taken a few months and a lot of trips to check out different spots, but when he'd seen Secret Valley for the first time, he'd known he was home. Vaughn forced himself to turn around after he'd reached the top of the rise and appreciated the view of the mountains for a bit. He jogged down the switchbacks, then sprinted down out of the canyon and back onto the pavement, taking in the view of the long, thin valley, the lake in the middle, the medium-sized town and college nestled near the foothills, and the jagged mountains surrounding the valley covered with pine, aspen, poplar, and maple trees. His realtor had done it. This valley was perfect for him. He was still recognized, but so far the paparazzi hadn't shown up, and nobody had mauled him. Yesterday, when he'd been shot in the cheek by Josh and met Josh's gorgeous mother, he thought he'd scored with the best neighbors on the planet. He'd been instantly impressed and attracted to Allison, and he'd never felt the level of warmth and connection when he'd touched another woman. It had been insane. He thought he'd found the most genuine and enthralling woman, the woman he had to spend more time with, get to know, and pray she could be interested in him like he was in her. She seemed more real and appealing every second they spent together, and her little boy was hilarious. Sadly, he'd messed it all up by trying to give her advice. She was probably still in her bed crying, and she probably hated him. He approached his new neighborhood. Every house was a beautiful 2-story, and each yard was spacious and professionally landscaped. It was probably the most expensive neighborhood in the valley, but everyone he had met had been welcoming and seemed down to earth. He was coming from a neighborhood in California where the houses sold for $10 million plus, and everyone tried to prove they were the top dog, so it may have all been relative. He was happy to be past that pride race. Being married to Tylee had taught him that he didn't care about money or fame, and he wanted people in his life who were genuine and could love him for him. He passed the small neighborhood park and stopped in his tracks. Allison and Josh. She was pushing him on the swing, and he was singing, "I'm on top of the world," at the top of his lungs. He was the cutest kid Vaughn had ever been around. Allison noticed him first. Her eyes were red and puffy, as if she'd been crying all night. He wished he could hold her close and promise it would get better, that he would make it better. Sadly, he didn't have the right, and he'd been much too forward with her yesterday afternoon and last night at the restaurant. He needed to tamp down the feelings she stirred in him and focus on being a good neighbor and hopefully a friend. She looked him over, and her eyes lit with appreciation, but then she seemed to remember she wasn't thrilled with him and his interference as her lips pressed thin and she looked resolutely away from him. "Vaughn!" The childlike yell echoed through the distance between them, and then Josh launched himself out of the swing. "Josh!" He and Allison both yelled at the same time. Josh hit the sand and rolled to a stop. Vaughn sprinted to the boy, but Allison got there first. She scooped him up in her arms, ignoring any protocol of checking for spine injuries. "Josh, oh baby, are you okay?" He grinned up at her. "That was a good jump." Vaughn laughed in relief. Allison shot him a look. The mother look. He stopped laughing immediately. "What were you thinking?" Allison asked Josh, ignoring Vaughn. "I saw my buddy Vaughn, and I jumped." Josh grinned at him, obviously unhurt. "Do you want to see how fast I can climb the rock wall and do the slides?" "For sure," Vaughn said. Josh slid out of Allison's arms and pumped away from them, scrambling up the small fake rock wall and then running along a bridge before sliding down the purple slide. He punched his fists in the air. "I'm the fastest ever." Vaughn cheered. "Nice, Josh." Josh grinned and took off running up a different section of the playground. Vaughn found himself standing next to a stiff Allison. He hoped he didn't stink from his run, but that was the least of his problems. He'd met the woman of his dreams and messed it all up. "I'm sorry about last night," he offered. "I don't really want to talk about it." "Oh, what was I to say?" He pushed a hand over his hair and focused on Josh running, climbing, sliding, and looking over at them every so often to make sure they were watching. "Josh is the cutest kid I've ever seen." She rolled on him, and he backed up a step. You know what you did to that cutest kid ever last night? You ruined his life." "I ruined his life?" "Completely." She folded her arms across her chest and looked so beautiful and uncertain he wanted to hug her. He stepped closer and hoped it wasn't just his pride talking as he tried to explain. "Hey, I'm sorry I shared my opinion, and I'm sorry I assumed I understood what you were going through. I just didn't want you to end up hurting worse than you already are. You don't know me or my situation," she threw at him. "You had no right to pin me against the wall and touch me like you did." Heat rushed through him, remembering that moment. It wasn't about how gorgeous she'd been in that red dress, though it was a factor. It was about how he felt about her, how appealing she was to him, how genuine she and Josh seemed. Family. How he wanted a family. "I apologize," he said huskily. She looked him over and trembled slightly. "You'd probably do it again." He met her gaze and his stomach tumbled. He found himself admitting, "In a second." A long moment stretched between them, with Josh's cheerful chatter sliding and climbing in the background. Vaughn eased closer. She held up a hand as if to ward him off. He probably did stink from his run. "Look," she said, "I shouldn't have accused you. I recognize it isn't your fault that I broke my heart, Ryan's heart, and Josh's heart last night." At least she wasn't blaming him. But was she serious about her broken heart? From what he'd seen, she didn't love that guy. He'd thought he loved Tylee, but now he knew he'd been broken and grasping for love in all the wrong places. As soon as he recognized their entire relationship had been fake, he'd healed quicker than he would have thought. But the guy Allison had been with seemed like a nice person, not a scheming nightmare, so maybe she loved him like a friend. "But you confused me with your good looks, the way it felt when our eyes met, and when you touched me. I've never felt that way before." His lips curved up. She did feel the same. There was a connection. He wasn't making it all up in his head. Yes. "And then I broke off a 2-year commitment. I hurt Ryan horribly, and Josh will be broken when he doesn't come back. I know it's not your fault, and I know it needed to happen, but I'm confused, frustrated, and sad. I need you to stay away from me for a while I calm down and figure out my life." Vaughn absolutely hated that twist. Stay away from her? He wanted to make getting to know her and Josh his top priority. He'd been concerned about how he'd fill his time being retired at 33, but they could take up all his time and he'd be thrilled. She stared at him with dark, serious eyes. "I'm serious. I need some space." "You don't even know me. Give me a chance, please. Let me show you I'm a nice guy, not a bad guy." "Please, I'm a mess." Her red eyes attested to that fact. She shook her head. "You confuse me and stir me up, and I can't handle that right now." Vaughn studied her. She was clearly serious, and he felt awful, like he had the flu. He'd been building up in his mind that he had a chance with her and Josh. Sure, they hardly knew each other, but she ditched the guy who wasn't right for her, and Vaughn was here, ready to get to know her, hopefully fall in love with her, and be the right guy for her and Josh. It was premature and stupid of him. Wasn't his failed relationship with Tylee enough? He'd gotten sick and tired of the media claiming he'd rushed things with Tylee because both of his parents had been dead. They'd been right, but he'd been a mess. His parents had contracted the Ebola virus while on a trip for the charity he funded in Liberia. The locals had done all they could, but hadn't dared transport them to modern medical care, and Vaughn hadn't been able to send help quickly enough. They died in the village without the chance to say goodbye to their only son. Vaughn kicked at a rock, feeling like a little boy. He hated being alone. He looked into Allison's gorgeous dark eyes. But this wasn't just about him wanting a family. Allison and Josh were incredible, and they could be the right fit for him. Why wouldn't she give him a chance and see he was right? "Okay," he muttered, not really having any other choice but to obey her request. "Thank you." He studied her and then turned and strode to the play set. He was tall enough that Josh was right on his level. He put out his hand and Josh slapped it. "Nice climbing, my man." "Thanks. Can we have an airsoft war today?" Vaughn could have sworn his heart twisted. "Sorry, man," he said to Josh. "I can't today, but we'll do it soon." He glanced back at Allison. She gave him a nod and almost a smile. She was grateful he was obeying her request, but she obviously didn't want him ingratiating himself into Josh's heart. He didn't want to take this Ryan's place. Okay, maybe he did. Josh's little shoulders slumped. "All right, I'm going to ask Santa for a gun like yours." He laughed. but that might be another mark against him for Allison. That automatic BB gun definitely needed adult supervision. I'll see you soon. Josh waved and took off for the slide. Vaughn risked one more glance at Allison. She had her arms folded tightly across her chest, and her face was closed off. He hated that she was hurting. Though she claimed she knew it wasn't his fault, she had clearly wrapped him up in the mess in her mind. He'd been trying to help last night, mostly. He loved being close to her, touching her, and knowing he affected her, so obviously part of his motive for her not to get engaged was selfish. He waved to her, turned, and jogged off down the street. He said a prayer for Allison and Josh. He didn't know what else he could do. Chapter 4. Allison and Josh didn't do much after the awful breakup with Ryan on Wednesday night. Losing Ryan had left her lonely, and all that pain of losing Jonah, her best friend and husband, had returned with a vengeance. She mourned, and to make it worse, Josh asked for Rye far too often. It was a miserable few days. She let him watch more shows and play on a device more than she ever did, and they spent a lot of time on walks and at the park while she tried to convince herself she wasn't hoping Vaughn would show up. She hoped she hadn't been too harsh with him, but she needed time. Finally, they made it to church on Sunday. She went to church with Josh, her dad, Noah, Savvy, Jason, and Brittany, surprised when she glimpsed none other than Vaughn Tabane in the back pew. He caused quite a stir, looking like hot man on a stick, in Savannah's whispered words, in his tailored blue-gray suit. Though Allison scolded Savannah loudly for the comment and made Jason and Noah laugh, she could admit Vaughn was incredibly appealing with his dark good looks, long and lean frame, and his unique green eyes. He caught her eye several times. She got warm all over just from looking at him. He seemed like a top-notch man, but she was still a mess from the way everything had ended with Ryan, and Vaughn's part in it made her feel an odd mixture of guilt and insatiable desire to spend more time with Vaughn. She wanted to know what he was really like behind the talent, the fame, and the way he'd made her tremble at his touch. She'd resisted the urge to Google him many times over the past few days, but she knew he'd been through his share of struggles with losing his parents and his short, highly publicized marriage to Tylee Hammond. Luckily, he was inundated with fans approaching him after the meeting, her dad, Noah, and Jason included. Savannah and Brittany stayed back and laughed at how starstruck their tough men looked. Brittany was a world-famous supermodel, so she got her fair share of attention, but everybody had settled down after the initial shock of a supermodel in their small valley, at least at church they had. When she and Jason came to town for errands or dinner, they still got a lot of attention. Allison escaped before Josh saw Vaughn, telling Savvy she needed to get him down for his nap. The family and Jason and Brittany came over for dinner, but Allison was too busy hosting, cooking, and cleaning up for Savannah to get her alone and drag all of her painful secrets out. There was so much talk during dinner about Vaughn Tabane being in their valley that she fought to keep her face straight. Luckily, Josh was distracted and busy and said nothing about their new neighbor. Monday morning, she was still thinking about Vaughn in that suit and wondering if she could force herself out of this funk. Allison and Josh usually went to the gym after he ate breakfast, but they'd missed the end of last week after everything had happened with Ryan. Josh loved the kids' club, and if Savannah was between training appointments, Allison would get an incredible workout with the top trainer in the valley, maybe in the state. She may have been a little prejudiced, but her younger sister was absolutely incredible as a trainer, a sister, a friend, an aunt, and a wife. Allison adored Savvy. Sometimes she had to remind herself to be a sister, not a mother. Their mom had been hard on Savvy as a young teen, and then passed away when the cancer returned with a vengeance. It had been rough and had taken time, patience, and Noah for Savannah to fully heal. Savvy was amazing, and she and Noah were incredible together. Knowing Savannah would be at the gym helped. She gave herself a pep talk. Today was Monday. Untold possibilities. A new week. New life. She and Josh would miss Ryan. She still missed Jonah. But they were young, healthy, and they had their whole lives in front of them. She prayed Ryan could move on, and she prayed she and Josh could as well. She was going to make today a great day, somehow. She carried Josh through the small gym parking lot because he'd been complaining since he woke up that his legs were broken. "I'm too tired to walk, Mama," he said groggily. He wasn't a morning person. She laughed. "It's all right." She actually enjoyed carrying him around. Most of the time he protested that he was big and didn't want her carrying him like a baby. So she took advantage of this opportunity to hold him. "You pull the door open." "Got it." Josh tugged at the door handle. Footsteps approached behind as someone jogged toward them. Allison glanced over her shoulder with a smile, but froze when she saw Vaughn. He looked just as good as he had all dressed up in church. How could he be that incredibly appealing in a t-shirt and shorts? It was the 3rd of October and only 40 degrees. Why didn't he have a bulky sweatshirt on? His muscular legs and arms made her mouth go dry. As their gazes collided, her stomach pitched, and 40 degrees was suddenly sweltering hot. He grinned as he caught and held the door open for them. Looking up into his handsome face, she felt like she'd found her favorite friend again. She'd also forgotten how tall and attractive he was. "Hey," he said in a soft, husky voice. Allison clung to Josh, her limbs suddenly weak and fearing she'd drop her child. Josh looked over her shoulder, and suddenly he didn't seem tired at all. "Vaughn!" He launched himself out of Allison's arms. Luckily, Vaughn caught him. Vaughn's grip made his shallow dimples appear, and the sight of her little boy cradled in that strong, brown arm made her wish she could paint portraits. Josh clamped his little palms on Vaughn's cheeks and demanded, "Airsoft war, today!" Allison froze. She should say no. No matter how perfect Vaughn seemed, she wasn't ready to develop a relationship with someone new. How could she deny her son when she'd been in a funk the last few days and hadn't been much fun for him? "I'd love to." Vaughn looked at her with pleading in his green eyes. "If you and your mom have time." "Well, we have time," Josh nodded seriously and said in a stage whisper, "You could get me out of chores." Allison laughed. How could she help it? Josh was adorable. Vaughn laughed with her, and it felt really nice. "How about this afternoon, when it's warmer?" she asked, and was rewarded with a huge grin from Vaughn. "Then you can still do your chores," she couldn't resist adding to Josh. "Oh boy," Josh sighed, and gave Vaughn a long-suffering look. "Chores are important," Vaughn told him. "Big people," Josh said in a voice that could have been a teenager's. They laughed together again. Somebody walked up and pulled the door open. Allison realized they were standing in the doorway, dumping cold air into the gym's foyer. She tore her gaze away and walked into the gym. Vaughn followed, holding Josh. "How do you work out with your mama, big guy?" Josh wrinkled his nose. "I've got my own class. Kids need me." Vaughn shook his head, laughing. "You're the best." Allison's heart warmed. Hadn't she told him last week she needed space? She was loving this interaction. Maybe half a week was enough space. If that was true, she really hadn't loved Ryan. But she wouldn't go there right now. "What is going on?" a female voice demanded from behind them. Allison whirled and smiled. "Savvy!" Josh cried out, but he didn't launch himself out of Vaughn's arms and run for his aunt like he normally would. Savannah strutted over to them. She was the most beautiful person. Allison adored her younger, spicier sister. The front desk girl and a few people walking from the weight room to the locker room stopped and stared, and she heard whispers of Vaughn Tabane. Oh brother, did he hate that? She would. Savannah gave Allison a quick hug, whispering, "Vaughn Tabane, truly?" "He's my neighbor," she whispered back. Savannah's eyebrows lifted. Allison knew she would get grilled later for purposefully omitting any interaction she'd had with Vaughn. Her sister turned to Vaughn and Josh. "Auntie Savvy." Josh stared up at his new hero. "This is my friend Vaughn. He has a wicked gun, he's huge, and he's not a bad guy." Vaughn held Josh in his left arm and reached out to Savannah with his right. "Savannah Shumway," she said proudly. She loved her married name, but only allowed a few people to call her Savvy. "Vaughn Tabane." "I know." He smiled. They shook hands, and Vaughn looked between her and Allison. "Are you twins?" Allison snickered as Savannah's jaw predictably dropped. "Absolutely not. She's 5 years older than me." "Oh, I can definitely see the age difference now." Now Allison was the one letting out a fake gasp. "No, you can't." Vaughn chuckled. "You're right, I can't." Allison wanted to keep teasing with him, but she was in danger of becoming a Vaughn Tabane groupie, begging him to work out with her, pulling out her phone and taking pictures of Josh in his arms. She had to put some space between them, and fast. "Come on, Josh. Let's get you to your class." She opened her arms. "All right." Josh pinned Vaughn with a serious look. "Airsoft after nap? My mama will text you." Vaughn grinned. "Sounds good." Josh transferred back to Allison's arms, and she had to fight to ignore the warmth of Vaughn's hands brushing her arms as he handed him over. "Have a good workout," she mumbled to Vaughn, and hurried through the foyer toward the back hallway. Nice to meet you, she heard Savannah say. You as well. Footsteps jogged after her, and soon Savannah was at her side. They walked to the back hallway and the kids clubbed together, greeting the workers, signing Josh in, and then waving goodbye as he ran off to be with his friends, happy as ever. Losing Ryan hadn't seemed to affect him, but Allison had lost people too often, and didn't want to go through it ever again. They headed out back into the hallway, and she could feel Savannah bursting next to her. Vaughn Tabane is your neighbor? She all but shrieked. Allison nodded, leaning against the wall. This might take a minute. When did you meet him? Last week. And you didn't tell me? Allison rubbed at her forehead. It was the day I broke up with Ryan. Oh. The glee in Savannah's eyes dimmed. She gave Allison a quick hug. I've got a training appointment. I'll call you later for details. Allison forced a smile. There are no details, Savvy. He's a nice, attractive guy. End of story. Beginning of story, Savannah teased, a glint returning to her brown eyes. And it's going to be such a great story. She clapped her hands together and then whistled. He's super hot and tough. Almost as hot and tough as Noah. Would you stop? Allison laughed, but then it hit her. Savannah didn't check out men besides Noah, and this was the second time she'd commented on Vaughn's hotness. He was a famous person, so maybe it was more like checking out a movie star or someone otherwise untouchable. Vaughn wasn't untouchable. She had in fact touched his chest, his hand, his arm. Touching him was very, very intriguing to her. Her face flamed red. Savannah burst out laughing. You like him. I do not. He's cute with Josh and that's it. End of story, she repeated. She simply wasn't ready for a new story. Didn't know when she'd ever be. Dang it, I've got to go. Savannah wrinkled her nose, turned and pranced away, but sang back over her shoulder. Beginning of story. Allison shook her head, smiling to herself. She followed Savannah into the combination weight room and cardio room on the first floor. The locker rooms, kids clubs, racquetball courts, and an indoor pool took up the other half of the main floor. There was an aerobics room, an additional cardio equipment room, spin room, yoga studio, juice bar, and hangout area upstairs. It was a great gym for their small valley of 20,000 people. As soon as she entered the weight room, she knew she was in trouble. Vaughn was using one of the cable machines, but as if he sensed her, he looked around and met her gaze, making her flush with warmth. Allison smiled, but turned away quickly. They'd reached a sort of truce, running into each other this morning, but she wasn't ready for a full-blown friendship. Not with a man that appealing. One who also seemed super interested in her. She got busy with her upper body strength training workout, but everywhere she went she could see him, feel his presence. She caught his gaze on her multiple times, but it didn't feel creepy. It was warm, like he was as drawn to her as she was to him, and could hardly keep his gaze from straying to her. She couldn't help but notice the other gym goers staring at him, especially the females. The weight room was quieter at this time of day. Most people were at work, and the moms who came and took their kids to the kids' care or had children in school usually opted for the spin, yoga, or aerobics classes over the free weights and cable machines. But a few young moms made eyes at Vaughn, flirtatious comments every time they got close to him. It fired Allison up. They were both married. Vaughn handled the attention surprisingly well. He was kind, but focused on his workout. Every time the women lingered close to him for too long, he moved on to another spot. As she finished a set of bicep curls, Vaughn walked up close and grabbed a pair of 45s. He smiled at her and stood a few feet away, imitating her lift. Her mouth went dry as she watched the way his biceps bulged. I need your phone number, he whispered. What? She sputtered. No, you don't. He grinned. I've got to set up playdates with my buddy Josh for Airsoft Wars. Allison smiled and shook her head. Setting her weights down, she turned to face him. Are you using my son to get my attention? Vaughn's eyes widened. He held onto his weights but stopped curling. No, I've been looking for some good airsoft competition for a long time. She arched her eyebrows. He was interested in her. She knew he was. It was equal parts thrilling, flattering, and terrifying. Don't get any ideas, Mr. Tabane. You and I are only friends. His grin grew. So we're friends then. That's progress. I meant neighbors. We're neighbors. That means you don't need my phone number. Come over at 3 and you can have your airsoft war. That's it. She tried to keep her words serious, but the glint in his green eyes made her think this man had plans for her. She liked the idea of that. The heartache of breaking up with Ryan suddenly seemed like months ago, not less than a week. Friendly neighbors, Vaughn corrected, giving her a wink that made her stomach take flight. I'll see you at 3, she said, hurrying around him. She worked out plenty. She obviously needed some food to fight this lightheadedness. I can't wait, he said in a deep, smoldering voice that followed her. Allison picked up her pace, but she let herself look back. He was watching. Her stomach went nuts and her mouth went dry. Food would help. Distance from him would help more. Oh goodness. She needed distance from him and those irresistible green eyes. Chapter 5. After Vaughn got home from lifting, he spent the morning and early afternoon organizing his storage room. He'd kept himself extremely busy since he got to Secret Valley, and he was happier here than he'd imagined he could be. He'd hiked all over the mountains encasing this small valley. He'd talked to the pastor at church and volunteered to work with the youth group on Wednesday nights. The pastor had been delighted. He'd gone to the local high school and volunteered to help the local basketball coach. The coach had been ecstatic, and he'd started meeting with the players in the mornings as it was still preseason. He spent a lot of time working with his charity supervisors. Everything was going well with the projects in Africa for clean water, gardening, teaching English, and creating work opportunities. He tried to keep his parents' legacy going and felt it was on track and helping many people. He should respond to all the emails from his agent, sponsors, and fans, but he'd call his agent and deal with everything else on the list later. Right now, it was time to have an airsoft war with Josh. Vaughn grinned as he grabbed the new airsoft pistol he'd ordered after he met Josh, hoping for this opportunity. It was a good pistol but had the lowest FPS he could find, so it wouldn't hurt Josh, he hoped. The kid was probably tougher than Vaughn was. He hurried outside. It was chillier today than it had been. He liked the chill and crisp air. He'd heard they had snow in October sometimes. How great would that be? He hurried across the sidewalk and up the steps to Allison's front porch. The door swung open before he could ring the bell, and Josh launched himself at him. Vaughn! Vaughn scooped him up. Were all kids this fun to be around? He'd rarely been around small children except to slap hands with them after he left a basketball court, visited hospitals with his mom, or did some publicity stunt for his agent or the team. He'd wanted to spend more time in the villages with the children his parents had loved so much, but he'd been too busy with his career, and then it had been too painful after losing them. Allison stood in the doorframe. She was exquisite with her long dark hair, olive skin, and dark eyes. He'd been around a lot of beautiful women who threw themselves at him, but Allison was genuine and more beautiful to him than any woman he'd met. Airsoft war, Josh called out before Vaughn could greet his mom. That's right. You ready to shoot the bad guy? Mama says you're a nice guy. He grinned. Did she now? Allison gave him a shrewd look. Don't make anything of it. Oh, I will. Now I'm the nice, friendly neighbor. Good luck with your airsoft war, she said. You're gonna need it, Josh crowed. He scrambled out of Vaughn's arms and gestured inside. Come on. Vaughn followed, rushing past Allison as he did so. His arm brushed hers, and he stopped and stared down at her. She was almost a foot shorter than him, but he didn't mind the height difference. Did she? Her pulse thrummed quickly in her neck, and she stared up at him with wide, dark eyes and soft lips. Very soft-looking lips. They hadn't been this close since that night at the restaurant, when he'd followed her into the hallway by the bathrooms. Just like that night, he rested his hand on the doorframe and leaned in. He looked over her beautiful face. Just like that night, she was holding her breath. He leaned down and said close to her cheek, Breathe. She gasped in air and planted her hands on his chest, just as she had that night. Her eyes widened, and he couldn't resist flexing, just a bit. It felt incredible to have her touch him. Stop, she managed in a breathy voice that shot desire through him. Vaughn, Josh hollered. Come on. They both startled, and she darted into the house. He followed her through the entryway and into an open great room, where Josh waited by the back patio doors with his gun in hand and 2 sets of goggles. Mama says we need eye protection. Smart, Vaughn managed, hoping his voice sounded level and not out of whack from the exchange in the entryway with Allison. Her house was spacious and very nice, with lots of windows and natural light showcasing her huge backyard filled with trees and a trimmed-down flower garden that was probably gorgeous in the summer. Nice house, he said. She nodded her thanks, but said nothing until they reached Josh. Then she gave a very forced smile. You two have fun. I'll watch from upstairs. You don't want to join us? Vaughn wanted her nearby at all times, but maybe it was selfish. Maybe it was premature, like she'd said last week. Couldn't she feel this insane magnetism between them? She'll be making her blankets, Josh said, like she always does. Blankets? Vaughn looked at her. It was hard to tell if she was blushing, but her tanned skin seemed darker. I make patchwork quilts. She looked out the window as if avoiding his gaze. Do you sell them? She was young to have this big, beautiful house, and he didn't think she worked. Maybe blankets were extremely lucrative to sell. No. She tapped her fingernails on the table. I donate them to hospitals and children's charities. That's amazing. She was amazing. His dad had been a preacher in the inner city, and his mom had cleaned commercial buildings at night, often giving Vaughn opportunities to help her and earn money for basketball. They never had much, and any extra money went to Vaughn's basketball so he could travel with elite teams, work with the best coaches, and achieve his dream of playing in the NBA. When he'd gotten his first fat paycheck, he'd paid off their home and set up a fund so they could travel and do the charity work they wanted. That work had eventually taken them both from him. It had admittedly rocked his faith, but he was in a good place now. He'd be in a better place if he could spend more time with Allison. Thanks, she murmured. Let's go, Josh begged, grabbing Vaughn's hand. The nice friendly neighbor is in demand right now, Vaughn teased Allison. She smiled and shook her head. He's not picky. He'd play airsoft with a 90-year-old grandma if she'd agree. Ouch, Vaughn chuckled. Don't make me feel special or anything. She lifted her eyebrows. Don't worry, I won't. But somehow she did, and Josh did. No matter the feisty words she threw at him, she seemed to enjoy teasing with him, maybe even liked him being around. Vaughn had a lot of friends, especially teammates from high school, college, and the NBA. But once you reached the status of athlete that he had, a lot of friendships changed. Teammates became more competitive or sometimes jealous, and others seemed to always have an ulterior motive for friendship. He had very few lifelong friends that he'd trust not to rat him out to the media if he said something wrong, clean out his bank account, or make a play for Allison. Vaughn let the little boy drag him outside, and they spent over an hour chasing each other around and having an airsoft war. A few times he caught movement in the upstairs window and saw Allison watching them. He'd wave and she'd wave back, and then Josh would tag him because he wasn't paying attention. None of the hits were as bad as the first time Josh had hit him in the cheek from a few feet away, but some of them did sting. He was impressed with how tough Josh was. The little guy didn't complain, even if he occasionally let out a groan of pain from a shot that hit the skin or was too close. As soon as Vaughn checked on him, he'd say he was fine and shoot Vaughn up close for his trouble. Josh was great. Drinks and snacks, Allison called from the deck. Woo-hoo, Josh hollered, racing for his mom. Vaughn strode after him, focused on the beautiful woman standing by the patio set. How had he been so engrossed in airsoft that he hadn't noticed her walking onto the patio with food and drinks? He climbed the steps and saw she had a platter of cheese slices, pickles, apple and pear slices, and a bowl full of almonds. The drinks were Propel and Gatorade. Josh shoved a half a cheese slice in his mouth and started telling Allison every detail about the war. She smiled and nodded, but her gaze kept flitting to Vaughn. He took a Propel, screwed off the lid, and took a long gulp. Then took a handful of almonds. Thank you, he said to Allison when Josh put too much apple in his mouth and couldn't speak for a moment. Sure, thanks for being so great with him. He's great. Josh smiled up at him and chomped on some almonds. Did all 3-year-olds eat healthy treats without complaining? His mom's version of a treat break would have been Ritz crackers with easy cheese from the can, homemade cookies, and Kool-Aid. His bite of apple caught in his throat, thinking of his mom. He missed her. I am great. Josh jutted out his thin chest. Vaughn and Allison both laughed, and they shared a look that he loved. They both agreed Josh was great. He suddenly knew he had to get closer to them and know the answers to some important questions. What had happened to her first husband? Had she healed from his loss? Why hadn't Ryan made the cut? Was she ready to date someone new? Sorry the snacks are so healthy, Josh said, taking a long drink of Gatorade. Mama forgot to buy Oreos and licorice at the store. He shook his head as if Allison had completely let him down. So I had to eat all the cookies we made the day I shot you. Allison stiffened, and Vaughn wasn't sure being reminded of that day was the best thing for any hope of getting to know her better. And he never wanted to get to know someone better like he did Allison. You had to, huh? Vaughn teased. Yep. Josh drank some Gatorade. That's okay, Vaughn reassured him. I like healthy snacks. Big people do, Josh nodded. Except Uncle Noah. He likes Oreos like me. He's super tough, but you's tough too. You eat Oreos? Yes, I do. Josh flexed his scrawny arm. Mama, are my muscles tough like Vaughn's? Allison smiled softly and said, I don't know. I might need to compare. Vaughn felt a flash of hope. What did that mean? Josh held up his arm, gritting his teeth, and he flexed. Vaughn, you need to flex so she can see who's tougher. Vaughn hid a smile and flexed his arm. Allison glanced over his arm and then the rest of his body, and he went hot all over. She moved close to Josh, bent down, and wrapped her hands around his small arm. Oh, that's big and tough, Josh. Nice muscles. Thanks, Mama. Josh dropped his arm and went back to shoving apple slices in. Now see if Vaughn is tougher. She straightened, swallowed, and then walked slowly to him. Vaughn gave her what he hoped was a charming smile and tightened his bicep muscle. She stepped right into his space, and his heart picked up. He felt like someone had hit him in the solar plexus. She smelled so good, like clean laundry and a soft floral perfume he couldn't put a name on. He pulled in a sharp breath and held it, savoring that scent and her being so close. Time seemed to slow down as their gazes caught and held, and he had a feeling he'd never tire of looking into her beautiful dark eyes. She looked up at him, fluttered those long eyelashes of hers at him, and whispered, "Breathe." Vaughn's breath rushed out in an unsteady laugh. Thanks, he managed. His arm was starting to hurt from holding it up and flexing for so long, but he wasn't about to complain as she gently wrapped her warm palms and fingers around his bicep muscle. He'd also never tire of her soft hands touching him. He was rewarded for his long-time flexing efforts and many, many hours in the gym when her hands couldn't make it all the way around the muscle and her eyes widened. Sheesh, your arm is huge, she murmured. Thanks. Maybe it wasn't a compliment. He chuckled and flexed even harder, making her eyes go wide and a sweet, "Oh," escaped those beautiful lips. I think the way you're looking at me is a compliment, he said huskily. Her gaze got even hotter, and she didn't release his arm. It was almost as good as when she'd touched his chest that fateful night. Who wins, Mama? Who wins? Josh demanded. Allison quickly released him and stepped back, smiling down at her son. It's a tough one, love. You're both super tough. Josh flexed both arms again. I know I am. Maybe we should measure your mama's muscles too, Vaughn suggested. Allison was extremely fit. He'd noticed every time he'd been around her, but it had been even more evident in that red dress Wednesday night and at the gym this morning while she lifted. She gave him a challenging look and flexed her arm. She had on a long-sleeved shirt, but her rounded, lean muscle was still evident. Vaughn eased closer and wrapped one palm around her arm. He only needed one hand to wrap all the way around her bicep, but her arm felt incredible. He'd been married to a famous actress and dated supermodels, and he'd never been around someone as attractive to him as Allison. She wasn't just pretty, she was real. He'd missed real since he lost his parents who'd grounded him in every way. Well? She tilted her chin up. Is it huge? Josh asked. Vaughn shook his head, staring into her dark eyes, and finding himself lost and found at the same time. It's perfect. I think your mama wins. Josh's little shoulders slumped. The women always win. Vaughn and Allison both laughed. He winked at her and said, At least he figured it out while he's young. I'm teaching him right. For sure. She stopped flexing and stepped back. He had no choice but to release her arm. She yanked her gaze from his and stacked the nuts bowl on the half-empty plate and the empty Gatorade and Propel bottle. Let me help, he offered. I've got it. Was this it? He'd had his fun game with Josh and some great moments with Allison, and now he would be dismissed again. Mama, Josh said before she could pick up the plate, can we make cookies with Vaughn? His mouth watered, helping her in the kitchen, brushing past her, catching her around the waist, and pulling her close while Josh was distracted by eating cookie dough. Not today, love, she said softly. Her gaze flitted to Vaughn and then away. His chest tightened. Dang. She didn't want him getting too comfortable with them, or maybe in her house. Josh's lower lip protruded. But I want to be with Vaughn more. Vaughn took a chance and said, What if we played some basketball? They both had decent hoops in their driveways. Josh squinted up at him. Are you any good? Allison burst out a laugh. Honey, he was a professional basketball player. Josh didn't react. The title obviously meant nothing to him. Noah, Jason, and Papa used to watch him on TV. She tried again. Had she ever watched him on TV? The way she had looked at him said maybe she had. Had she been impressed? Josh shrugged. So you're good. Pretty good. Allison laughed again, shaking her head. He liked hearing her laugh. Can we play then, Mama? Sure. Vaughn lit up. She wouldn't push him away completely. Maybe she just wasn't ready for him to be in their home. Maybe she'd seen through him to the intimate images he had of cookie making. Will you play with us, Mama? Josh asked. Her eyes flashed indecision. He'd seen what a great mom she was, and she probably wanted to be with her son, but she still wasn't sure how close she should be to Vaughn. How long would it take her to move on from some guy she obviously hadn't loved? What about her husband who'd passed? Was Vaughn a jerk to push her to give him a chance? Okay. Vaughn's pulse sped up again, and he had to remind himself to breathe. Great. My driveway or yours? He also had a suspended 4-car garage with an indoor sports court underneath it. But if she wasn't ready for him to spend time in her home, he highly doubted she'd take an invitation to his. Let me get my shoes and gloves, and we'll come over to yours. I don't think we have a ball. He smiled. Sounds great. I might have a few. She laughed. I bet. We don't need to use the one you used to win the NBA championship, or the one you signed by the Olympics team you were on. That won't impress you? Interesting she knew he'd won the championship and been on the Olympics team. She shook her head. What would impress you? They'd been teasing, but he was serious. He'd had so many women throw themselves at him from high school on up. It seemed to come with the territory of being good at sports. This woman definitely hadn't thrown herself at him. But Allison had shown him some vulnerable moments. Times where he thought he affected her. Mostly she seemed unimpressed by his superstar status. That was as unique as she was. She shrugged. I'll think about it and get back to you. He had to laugh at that. I'll bug you about it. See that you do. She took the platter of treats and drinks and said over her shoulder, See you in a minute. Vaughn watched her go and waved to Josh. See ya, big guy. Josh said in a silly voice. See ya, tough guy. Josh flexed one more time. Then they went through the porch. Vaughn hurried off the porch, through the yard, and to the gate. He had to find one of his outside balls, brush his teeth, and change his shirt, and put on some deodorant and cologne. His basketball skills, long arms, and the easy charm his buddies claimed he had with the ladies would be useful in the next hour. Chapter 6. Allison's stomach pitched nervously as they walked out their front door and to Vaughn's driveway. She may or may not have brushed her teeth, checked her makeup, and spritzed on her gardenia body splash. Vaughn was impressive in a lot of ways. She could admit that. To think he was interested in being around her and Josh was flattering. But there were a lot of red flags about dating a celebrity, and she could be the poster child for not only fearing loss, but taking relationships slow. She dated Jonah the last 2 years of high school and most of college before he'd finally talked her into marrying him. She dated Ryan for 2 years and it had gone nowhere. Vaughn seemed to move fast, as evidenced by their instant connection when they'd met and how close he'd gotten to her at the restaurant that night. He was an expert at getting into her space and making her want him there. She didn't know if she should encourage him, but he made it difficult to resist. When they'd had their flexing and measuring contest, she thought she might swoon holding on to that large bicep and gazing up into his green eyes like an easily impressed teenager and not a responsible mother. But who could blame her? Even Savannah and Brittany got a little silly when they talked about Vaughn. The thumping of a ball on concrete announced Vaughn walking out of his open garage. Josh broke from her hand and rushed at his friend. Vaughn's handsome face broke into a wide grin, and he immediately scooped up Josh with one arm and held the ball in the other. Allison's heart squeezed. Jonah had died when she'd been pregnant, so Josh had never known his dad. Her dad, Noah, Jason, and Ryan were all great with him, but there was a connection between him and Vaughn that seemed to sparkle, as if they were father and son. Oh my, what was she thinking? That was nuts. Slow down, Allie. Vaughn turned her way. His green eyes were alight with happiness. He tilted his chin up to her and said, Hey, beautiful, ready to play ball? Her neck and cheeks went hot. You haven't earned the right to compliment yet, superstar. He chuckled. Got to impress you first? Yes, sir. He pumped his eyebrows and handed Josh the ball. Grip it tight, he cautioned. You ready? Yes, Josh cried. Vaughn carried her boy close to the hoop and easily lifted him within inches of the basket. His arm muscles flexed beautifully, but it was the image of the huge superstar and her boy that she never wanted to forget. Slam it, buddy. Josh slammed the ball through the hoop. He whooped, I did it! Allison cheered. Impressed? Vaughn asked her, giving her an irresistible wink. She shrugged. Impressed with Josh's slam dunk? Yeah, man, Josh called, punching a fist in the air. Vaughn laughed. He carried Josh after the still rolling ball and swooped it up easily while holding her boy. He was huge. She'd let herself look at his stats, and she'd finally ditched her self-control and watched a dozen YouTube highlight videos this afternoon, while she should have been making blankets during Josh's nap. Vaughn was 6'7" and 260 pounds, a foot and an inch taller than her, and twice her weight. She'd seen him play before, but watching those clips now and knowing him personally, he was more than impressive. Just watching him move was like poetry in motion. Vaughn helped Josh slam the ball several more times. Allison watched and clapped, and then she couldn't resist pulling out her phone and snapping some pictures. Vaughn, of course, noticed that. He cradled Josh in one arm after they'd shot the ball together and held up his free hand. Oh, ma'am, none of that. You have to check with my agent to get this handsome mug in a picture. Oh, there's a fee for taking pictures of your handsome mug? His cheeks wrinkled in a grin. For sure. Imagine the money you could make. She lifted her phone and swiped back through the pictures. I only got your backside. I'm sure that's free of charge. He pumped his eyebrows. It's more expensive than my face. She hid a laugh and rolled her eyes. So cocky, even for a superstar. Are we going to play ball or what? Let's do it. Okay, Josh. He set him on the ground. You and your mom against me. I want to be on your team, Josh insisted. Vaughn lifted his hands to her, looking somehow innocent and sexy at the same time. The little man knows superstar power when he sees it. Allison hurried over and grabbed the ball off the ground. She dribbled slowly, realizing how quickly he would notice that she was terrible at basketball. I'll show you superpower. She ran at the hoop, dribbling as fast as she could, and trying to keep the stupid ball under control. She lifted the ball for a layup, and it was obvious she would miss badly. Vaughn came out of nowhere. He scooped the ball off the tips of her fingers, flew toward the basket, and slammed it through the hoop. Allison stood there, shaking her head. What just happened? He flexed and then grabbed the bouncing ball and dribbled it easily. Impressed? Josh was hooting and cheering loudly. He schooled you, Mama. Oh, so impressed, she taunted Vaughn. You just stole the ball from a 5'6" girl who's never played a day of basketball in her life. She dodged at him and tried to steal the ball. He easily evaded her, dribbling it from hand to hand. She grabbed his arm, his nicely toned arm, and tried to wrench him to a stop. He laughed and switched the ball to his left hand, tossed it up without even looking at the hoop, and it sunk it through. She held onto his arm but stopped fighting. That was ridiculous. Who makes crap shots like that? A superstar. He patted his chest, and she couldn't help but laugh. He grabbed the ball and tossed it at her. Let's see what you got. You back off first, she taunted him, dribbling backward and out of his space. I want Josh to guard me. Okay. He held up his hands and backed away, folding his arms across his chest and watching her with a smirk. I got her, Vaughn, Josh called, rushing at her and swatting at the ball. Allison avoided him, barely. She dribbled to the hoop, pulled up, and shot from a few feet away. It was a horrible shot, and bounced awkwardly off the backboard and went flying. Vaughn darted toward the backboard and lifted one hand, and easily caught the ball. She'd noticed on the highlight clips how his hands seemed to snatch the ball no matter where he was. He led the league in rebounds, and his team in points several years in a row. It was insane to be playing basketball with an NBA superstar. Josh, he called. Josh ran at him. Vaughn softly passed him the ball. Josh caught it and ran around with it. Traveling, Allison called. She didn't know that much about the game. Vaughn smiled and patiently showed Josh how to dribble nice and soft, keeping it under control. It was adorable watching them together, and cute to see Josh concentrating so hard on what Vaughn was saying and showing him. Vaughn was going to have a horrible crick in his back from leaning over to help her little boy. He didn't seem to care. After a few minutes, Vaughn said, Okay, you've got this. Dribble in for a layup. Josh nodded seriously. He tried to dribble it and keep it low. Each dribble went close to his head, and he almost lost control of the ball. Allison hurried at them, not wanting to steal it from her boy, but wanting to make an effort at this impromptu game. Vaughn picked Josh and the ball up, did a swim dodge with her boy over the top of her head, and lifted Josh to the hoop. Josh slammed it down and crowed, "We're killing you, Mama." "Yes, you are." Vaughn smiled good-naturedly and tossed her the ball. She knew she couldn't get around him dribbling, so she took a shot immediately. He jumped and grabbed the ball mid-air, landing easily and dribbling it. Her mouth dropped open. "You are such a show-off." "I'm just hoping to impress you." She shook her head, hoping he couldn't read how impressed she was. "You haven't yet, but I'll let you know when you do." He chuckled and passed the ball to Josh. Josh awkwardly dribbled it toward the hoop. Allison went to intercept him. Vaughn wrapped his arms around her waist, lifted her away from Josh, and spun her in his arms. She stared up into his handsome face, and the ground shifted. "I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure that's a foul," she said breathily. His arms stayed around her, and she could hardly think straight. "What's my penalty?" he asked, leaning closer. The ball bounced behind them. She should turn and watch Josh shoot, but she couldn't drag her gaze away from Vaughn's face. "I don't know. I think I get to take foul shots?" She arched up. "I'd love to take a shot," he breathed, his lips inches from hers. "Are we still talking about basketball?" "Not at all." She had no clue what was happening, but she had never wanted something to happen so badly. The ball suddenly smacked her in the arm. Allison startled and jerked away from him. Vaughn's brow squiggled, but he didn't get upset at the interruption. "Later?" he asked softly. She bit at her lip and tried to regain her sanity. "Slow down, superstar," she murmured. She needed to take her own advice. She didn't know this guy. Just because he was famous did not make him trustworthy. Yet he seemed trustworthy, and appealing, and cute with Josh, and irresistible. "Please stop," she begged her brain. He nodded, though his green eyes told her he didn't want to slow down. He took his time, releasing her to grab the ball and bounce it as if it was an extension of his body. She wanted to know so much about him. How long had he played ball? What had happened to his marriage? How was he dealing with it? How was he dealing with losing both of his parents? Losing her mom had about devastated her, but she'd had to stay strong for her dad and Savannah. Losing Jonah had devastated her, but her dad, Savannah, and Josh had gotten her through. "Hey Josh," he said, Do you want me to teach you some more?" "Yes," Josh cried out, hurrying close for his lesson. Allison stepped back, trying to catch her breath. She watched as Vaughn worked with him on dribbling, shooting, and even defense. It was great to watch them work together, and she tried to learn as well for when Josh was older, so she could teach him. It was good Josh had interrupted her. She couldn't be kissing this guy, no matter how appealing he was. An hour later, her fingers had lost feeling beneath her thin gloves. She needed to get home and make dinner. She hated to interrupt, but she said, "Josh, we've got to go, love." Josh and Vaughn both turned to her, pleading in Josh's dark eyes and Vaughn's green ones. "Maybe we'll see Vaughn tomorrow," she said quickly, before either of them tried to extend their playdate again. This afternoon had been great. Maybe they could take it slow, and she could learn to trust Vaughn, forget about Ryan, and finally move on from Jonah. Actually, she hadn't thought about Ryan once, and Jonah only occasionally. Josh hadn't asked about Ryan for a couple days. That was telling and very sad. Ryan was a fabulous guy. "I'll plan on it," Vaughn said smoothly. "Airsoft war from 3 to 4, then basketball practice from 4 to 5. Allison's eyebrows lifted, and warmth filled her. "We might be busy." He studied her, looking for a weakness. "Are you?" Allison really wasn't. She loved being with her son and was grateful Jonah had set them up financially so she didn't have to work. Raising Josh alone was hard enough. She couldn't imagine having to wake him early and rush to a job each morning. At the same time, she sometimes wished for more to fill her day. They went to the gym each morning, did errands and jobs and his chores, read a lot of books and played a lot of games in the winter, and went to the park or for a hike each day in the summer. She made her blankets while he napped. If her family didn't come around in the evening, she tried to teach and entertain Josh more before bed. It was a good life, and Josh was her everything. But what would it be like to have more? A husband, more children. But more people to love meant more people to lose. She feared loss worse than she feared Wesley Richards showing up on her doorstep once he was released from prison. "We might be able to squeeze you in," she admitted. His wide grin made her breath whoosh out. "Why don't we make it a standard date?" "Slow down, superstar." She planted her hands on her hips. "We'll take it one day at a time." His eyes reflected his disappointment, but he didn't say anything. He held out his hand for Josh to high five. Josh jumped high and high fived him, then hugged him around the thighs. "Thank you, Vaughn. I love you." Josh told everybody he loved them, but Vaughn obviously didn't know that. His eyes widened and his mouth went slack, and Allison felt the strangest tug at her heart. When was the last time somebody had told Vaughn they loved him? Vaughn squatted down and gave Josh a quick hug. He straightened and backed away. "Thank you, Josh. I love you too." Allison let the moment settle for a few beats. It was powerful, and even Josh seemed to feel the sincerity in Vaughn's words. She extended her hand to her boy, and he trotted over, putting his small, warm hand in hers. Her heart lifted. How she adored her boy. He was sunshine and love, and she wouldn't survive without him. She lifted her free hand to Vaughn, and he returned the gesture. Walking away with Josh skipping at her side was hard. She didn't want to leave Vaughn, and that should scare her more than how fast he seemed to want their relationship to progress. She made it to her driveway without looking back, but as she reached her porch, she glanced over her shoulder. He held the ball to his chest with both hands, arms rippling with muscle. Though she loved his tough build, it wasn't his body that made her quiver. It was the warm, irresistible look in his green eyes. She could have stared at him all day, but a white four-door Chevy pulled into the circle drive. Noah and Savannah popped out. "Uncle Noah, Auntie Savvy." Josh ripped from her grasp and pumped down the porch steps. Noah was closer and swept her boy into his huge arms. Savvy came around and kissed Josh's cheek. "Hi, handsome." "I had an airsoft war and played basketball with Vaughn," Josh yelled excitedly. "He's the best." Noah and Savannah looked over to Vaughn's driveway. He was still standing there holding the ball. He palmed it with one hand and lifted the other in greeting, but looked a little awkward at being caught staring. Noah waved too, looking at his superhero longingly as if he wanted to go play basketball with him. He tore his gaze away though and said, "Allie, there's something important we need to tell you." Allison's heart leapt. "You're having a baby." Noah shook his head and Savvy's dark eyes looked concerned. What was going on? "Oh, okay." Disappointment filled her. If she couldn't have more babies, she wanted to at least have the chance to be as incredible an aunt as Savannah had always been for Josh. Savannah was almost 26, just a little younger than Allison had been when she'd gotten pregnant with Josh. She pushed babies out of her mind, wondering what was going on. "Come in." Noah nodded and carried Josh up the steps with Savannah close by his side. They all looked over at Vaughn one more time, almost as if on signal. Vaughn smiled, and Allison felt her heart clutch for him. How could a famous superstar athlete look like he just wanted to be invited over? Like a small boy who was left out of a party. She wanted to rush over and drag him into their family circle, but she had to slow this down and not set her and Josh up for more loss. Right now, there was obviously something going on that Noah needed her to know about. She smiled at Vaughn, trying to encourage him without encouraging him, which made no sense to her. Then she turned and pulled the door open. Noah caught the door and held it for her and Savvy, then followed them inside. Savvy didn't even tease her about Vaughn, and that made Allison more nervous than anything else. As soon as they made it into the great room, Savvy said to Josh, "I want you to show me that new game on your iPad." Josh looked at his mom with wide, hopeful eyes. She didn't love him spending time on devices. Usually he had to earn his time, half an hour of device time for every half hour of chores spent. For every half hour spent doing chores. "Can I?" he asked. Whatever was going on must be serious for Savannah to overstep Allison's rules. She smiled, hoping it wasn't shaky. A pit opened wide in her stomach, and her palms went sweaty. She wanted to demand they tell her if everybody they loved was okay. Please don't let somebody else I love die." "Sure, sweetie." She walked shakily to the counter, grabbed the iPad with clammy hands, typed in the code, and handed it to him. Noah settled down on the couch with Josh on his lap. Savannah pressed against his side. Josh was completely distracted, but Savannah's dark eyes seemed terrified. No. Hadn't they been through enough, losing Mom and Jonah, and then being attacked by that jerk Wesley Richens a year and a half ago? Noah studied Allison as she sank onto a chair perpendicular to them. Please tell me Dad's okay. Their father was awesome and very involved in their lives. Noah and Savannah's gorgeous, restored house was only a few blocks from here, and their dad lived in a condo across the lake. Dad's fine. Allison let out a breath and said a quick prayer of gratitude. He wanted to be here, but he was on a conference call. He'll come by as soon as he's done. He agreed we needed to get to you before you heard. Savannah rushed out. Luckily, you never look at the news or social media. What's going on? Allison clenched her hands together. Was something wrong with Savannah or Noah? Fear wanted to make her gag. They'd each been through the heartache of losing their mom as teenagers. Last year they'd learned to love and to trust each other. Their path hadn't been easy, but they were both so incredible. Please, please, Father above, not cancer or some kind of illness, please. Noah cleared his throat and looked to Savvy. She nodded. Allison grasped the edge of the couch and dug her fingernails into it, probably ruining the leather finish. She didn't care. Cold sweat pricked at her neck and back. You remember Wesley Richens? Noah asked. Of course she remembered Wesley Richens. The too handsome guy who'd started flirting with her at the gym and then showed up at her house, chased her when she'd refused to succumb to him, and knocked her down the stairs. She'd been in a coma, and he'd kept her there, paying a nurse to drug her so she could go after Savannah. He'd kidnapped Savannah and was now in prison on a second-degree felony conviction for kidnapping, 3 to 15 years. He was a selfish nightmare. Why would she want to hear about him? You're both okay? She demanded. Noah and Savannah exchanged a look and nodded. Look, Auntie, Josh demanded. She looked at his game. Wow, you're doing great, bud. Jason and Brittany are okay? Yes. Allison relaxed her grip on the couch and rested back against the cushions. Okay, why are you bringing up Wesley Richens? He got released from prison yesterday. Early release for good behavior, and I'm sure his dad in the governor's seat had some influence on it. Allison's breath whooshed out like somebody had punched her. He wouldn't dare come after either of you, Noah reassured her. But I've got a friend coming to check your security cameras and sensors just to make sure everything we installed is in good order. Your dad offered to stay with you if you want. Savvy and I could stay too. Allison stared at him. If he wouldn't dare come after me or Savannah, why the precautions? Noah looked down at Josh, and Savannah's dark eyes grew determined. We'll never let anything happen to you or Josh, Allie, Noah said fiercely. Never. Allison felt emotion rise in her throat. She adored Savvy, and Noah was like the brother she'd always wanted. I know you won't. Like you said, he wouldn't dare come after me. He'd go right back to prison. We'll be fine. Noah and Savvy both nodded as if reassuring her, or maybe themselves. Allison looked at her little boy, and fear eclipsed the tender emotion of knowing how much Noah and Savannah cared. Wesley Richens was out of prison. Soon it would be nighttime, and she'd be alone with her fear. Chapter 7. Vaughn felt a pang of loneliness. He wanted to chase after Allison and her family. After spending the afternoon playing with Josh, he should respond to emails and analyze how his charitable foundations and investments were doing. But the only thing he wanted to do was spend more time with Allison and Josh. He'd hoped that her brother-in-law would want to chat, or even better extend an invitation to hang out with all of them. He'd met Noah, Jason, and even Allison's dad on Sunday. It'd all been great. He'd hoped it would give him an in with Allison. Apparently not. He dribbled and shot for a while, hoping they might come back out. No such luck. He went inside, made himself a steak and veggie pasta, and baked cookies by himself, wishing he could do it with Allison and Josh. He ignored his pile of work, knowing he couldn't focus, and talked to his good friend Bo on the phone for an hour. Then finally settled down and read a Clive Cussler novel. He was busy, and his life was fulfilling, but he felt lonely for Allison and Josh. He kept checking out the windows that gave him a view of Allison's house. When Noah and Savannah drove away, he wanted to rush over there, but he forced himself not to reveal how much he liked her already. Before he headed to bed, he walked out on his front porch. The cold air stung his cheeks and hands. Allison's house was all lit up. She had to be awake. He hung his head. She told Josh they'd see him tomorrow. That had to be enough. He headed back inside. The next morning he went on a long run in the chilly air, and then idiotically showered and changed before heading for the gym. If there was a chance Allison would be there again, he wanted to look and smell good. Even when he thought he loved Tylee, he hadn't been this excited about any opportunity to see her during their whirlwind courtship. Sadly, Allison kept pushing him away, and he kept hoping for more. Basketball had gone so well yesterday, and they'd set up the playdate for this afternoon. He shouldn't push his luck. He walked into the gym and thought he spotted her over by the elliptical machines. He checked in, barely hiding his impatience with the flirtatious front desk girl, forced a smile, and hurried away. He strode through the gym, waving and grinning and returning hellos to people who called out to him, people he didn't know but who knew him. He made it to the ellipticals and saw Allison's sister encouraging her client to do a cardio burst. Savannah looked over at him and a sneaky smile grew on her face. Hey. He tilted his chin up, deflated. Slow it down and recover, Savannah instructed her client. Looking for my sis? She asked Vaughn. He lifted his shoulders. Was it that obvious? She laughed. You rushed up to us, those green eyes lit up like it was Christmas morning, until you realized it was me and not her. Vaughn liked her sister, but he didn't know how to answer her question without admitting how gone he was over Allison. He glanced at her client, a petite 40-something blonde. She smiled, looking exhausted. Hey. How's it going? He managed. Awful. Savannah kills me. He smiled at that but looked to Savannah, unable to resist asking, Is she coming? This is her regular time. She only misses if she or Josh are sick. His heart picked up a beat. Thanks. He looked more genuinely at the blonde on the elliptical. Have a good workout. I'll try. Savannah obviously wanted to drill him with questions, but either she didn't want to do it in front of her client or she knew Allison wouldn't like it. She simply waved at him. Vaughn waved back and hurried over to the free weights to warm up. Allison was coming. He wanted to wait by the front door so he could hold it open for her, have Josh fling himself into his arms, tease with both of them, and see their smiles. He forced himself to remain where he was. He was obviously coming on too strong, and she told him a few times to slow down. He smiled to himself. No woman had ever told him to slow down. But he'd never been this interested in any other woman, and he'd never come on too strong before. Even his former wife Tylee had been the driving force in their relationship, not him. He glanced in the mirrors and saw Allison. His heart sped up. She walked towards Savannah and her client. He waited, hoping she'd catch his eye. She did, and he felt like he was running sprints. He hoped his eyes were begging her to come talk to him. She gave him a flicker of a smile and hurried to her sister. They talked with bent heads for a few seconds. He looked serious. Was it about him? Allison straightened and said something to the blonde lady, waved to Savannah, and then strode toward the cable machine. Vaughn's heart sank. He focused on lifting, but he wanted her to come talk to him. He went through his entire lower body routine, almost an hour and a half of lifting. His legs were shot by the end. He tried valiantly throughout the workout to catch her eye, get closer to her, or talk to her. The few times he'd gotten close, she'd given him one-word answers, a brief smile, and then edged away. Dang, what had caused this setback? He'd pushed too hard yesterday. Should he show up for their airsoft and basketball date, or did she regret agreeing to that? She disappeared, and he was pretty certain she'd gone to get Josh. He had to at least try and have a conversation with her, and see if she was still planning on this afternoon. His heart felt heavy in his chest as he tried to time it perfectly, casually walking through the weight room, waving goodbye, and talking to a few people who were enamored at meeting him. He sauntered through the entryway. She wasn't coming. If he waited outside, would he look like a creeper? He could go into the locker room and wash his hands, then come back out, but he might miss her. Dang, this was not going well at all. He finally found a genuine, irresistible, charitable woman who he was extremely interested in, and she didn't seem to return his interest, except a few times when he'd gotten close to her and teased with her. He thanked the front desk girl, talking to her a lot more patiently than he had when he'd come in. Finally, he had no choice but to head for the front doors. He'd walk slow and pray she caught him in the parking lot, but she'd avoided him for the past hour and a half. What made him think she'd want to chase him down now? He went out the door, His legs felt like lead, and he didn't think it had to do with his early morning run and the long weight training session. As he approached his Porsche Cayenne, and still didn't hear footsteps coming from the gym doors or Josh's chatter, he put his hand on his door handle and it beeped and opened. He'd just have to wait until this afternoon and see how it went. The gym door whooshed open. Vaughn turned around, hope filling him. "Vaughn!" Josh grinned happily at him. Vaughn couldn't stop himself from jogging back to them. Josh's face was lit up in his characteristic wide smile, but Allison looked more cautious. Her dark eyes focused in on his face, and she gave him a hesitant smile. "Hi," he said as he approached. Josh launched at him, and Vaughn easily caught the small boy. "Vaughn!" he yelled. "I practiced basketball with my Uncle Noah last night. Then I teach my friends at the kids' club. We didn't have a hoop, and our ball was too soft to dribble right, but I showed him my moves." Vaughn laughed. He truly loved this little guy, and Josh had said he loved him too. Too fast? Maybe for Allison, but not for him. "I bet you did great. I can't wait to play with you this afternoon." "It's too long to wait," Josh exclaimed. He turned to his mom. "Please, Mama, please, no chores. Let's play with Vaughn." Vaughn knew his eyes were begging her too, but he knew she would shoot him down without even looking. She shook her head and held out her hands for him. "No, sweetie. We'll see Vaughn after your nap." Josh buried his head in Vaughn's neck and muttered mutinously, "Chores are stupid and naps are for babies." Vaughn loved having this kid in his arms and thought his comments were hilarious. But he saw Allison's face tighten. As the mom, she was probably duty-bound to reprimand his buddy. Vaughn hefted him up so Josh could look into his eyes. "Chores and naps are super important, buddy. I'll carry you to the car, and we'll have the best time ever this afternoon with airsoft war and then basketball." After yesterday afternoon, he'd hoped he could talk Allison into dinner tonight with the three of them, but she was so closed off right now that his gut was churning. Josh gave him a sad smile and then nodded. "Okay." Allison started walking across the parking lot. Vaughn followed, carrying Josh. They were all strangely silent, even Josh. Could he sense his mom wasn't happy with Vaughn? Why? He hadn't done anything. Okay, maybe he'd pushed her too hard, but most single women in America, and many foreign countries, would give their favorite purse for a chance to talk to him for 1 minute. Why not her? It was one factor that made her so appealing, but it was also maddening. He liked her being hard to get, but he couldn't handle her being impossible to get. They made it to her Lexus sport utility, and the car beeped open as she reached it. Vaughn opened the back door with one hand and settled Josh into his car seat. He looked over the buckles and didn't want to do it up wrong. "You got this, buddy?" Josh nodded seriously. "I'm 3, Vaughn." Vaughn chuckled. He couldn't help it. Josh acted like he was 23 sometimes. He loved when the kid said his name. "Okay." He put out his fist and Josh bumped it. "I'll see you at 3, Mr. 3. Josh shook his head as if the joke was lame. It was. Vaughn smiled and shut the door, then turned to Allison. Instead of saying anything, she reached for her own door handle. He reached for it too, and their hands brushed. She startled and yanked her hand back like she'd touched a rattlesnake. Staring up at him, she pushed out a sigh. "Look, Vaughn, you're great. I appreciate you being so cute with Josh, but I'm not in a position to start a relationship right now." He hadn't even asked her to, but she seemed to read him far too easily. "Because of that guy you broke up with?" She nodded. "And some other reasons." He wanted those other reasons. He needed those other reasons. Instead, he splayed his hands and stepped back. Hey, I don't want to push you." "Good, thanks." She reached for her door again. He did not like that at all. He stepped back in and put his hand over hers on the door handle. Fire rushed through him at the simple touch. She glanced up at him, and that fire turned into an inferno. There was something about her. She was genuine, impressive, and a great mom. Fun to talk to and tease. She was genuine, impressive, a great mom, fun to talk to and tease, and she made quilts for charity. His mom would have loved her. "Please, Vaughn," she whispered. The please about killed him, but he didn't move his hand, not yet. "Please, Allie," he whispered back. She gave him a slight smile and said quickly, "It's nothing you've done. I just need time and space right now." Well, some of that was reassuring. He'd always been naturally confident, and his success with athletics had encouraged that confidence. But with her, he was like a teenage geek, all gangly, long limbs, smelly armpits, and a severe case of acne. Can I keep doing airsoft wars and basketball with Josh? She licked her lips, and he got a bit distracted. His gaze lingered on her lips before he forced it back to her eyes. Every day, she squeaked out. Every weekday. He held his breath and prayed like he had when he got the news that his parents were sick, booked a flight, and started calling in favors to get a doctor and medical help to their village. None of his prayers or efforts had worked that day. He didn't know why he was so hopeful now. She swallowed and looked him over and said, "Breathe." Vaughn let out a breath and laughed softly. Every weekday? He hated that he'd made it a question. He said nothing for far too long, then finally blew out a breath. A few days a week. Okay. He would take what he could get. She wasn't shutting him out completely. He'd have time with Josh a few afternoons a week. Would she join them for basketball like she had yesterday afternoon? He'd pray for small miracles and someday grow brave enough to ask for more. "See you at 3, she said. He nodded and lifted his hand from hers. She pulled open the door handle and he swung the door wide. She slid in and gave him a weak smile. "Bye." "Bye, Vaughn, you goofy poofy," Josh called from the back seat. Vaughn grinned at the little guy. "Bye, Josh, you silly Willy." Josh laughed at that one. Vaughn looked back at Allison. She was smiling slightly at him. But it was time to shut the car door and back away. It was hard to do it, but he did. Allison started the car and drove away quickly. Vaughn didn't move for a bit. He hadn't been shut out completely, but this was a setback. She wasn't ready. She must have loved that other guy to be so cautious with Vaughn. Or maybe it had to do with her husband dying. Or maybe, even though she said it wasn't Vaughn's fault, maybe he'd pushed too hard. Who knew? Sadly, he had far too much time to analyze it. Chapter 8. The next 6 weeks passed quickly. Allison checked over her shoulder for Wesley Richens, kept bear spray in her car, entryway, and a drawer by her bed, and jumped at every noise in the night. But she enjoyed most of the 6 weeks, in particular any time they spent with Vaughn. She saw him at the gym each morning. They fell into a pattern of him walking her in and out of the gym, carrying and teasing with Josh. Quite often, she and Vaughn made cute comments to each other while they lifted, and caught each other's gazes in the mirror. It was a thrill to have the famous, larger-than-life, handsome superstar only have eyes for her. But Vaughn was so much more than some handsome face, a well-built body, or famous title. He was kind, fun to be around, and charitable. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, he and Josh played airsoft. Allison made some kind of snack, and then they all played basketball. If it was too cold, raining, or snowing, they went into Vaughn's basement and played basketball. It had been a leap of faith to go into his house, but she knew now he was a good guy, and she trusted he would be kind and patient with her and Josh. She couldn't explain why she had to take it slow when she was so attracted to him. She was so attracted to and impressed with Vaughn, but an aching fear of loss remained lodged in her chest. Her mom, Jonah, and even Ryan were now gone from her life, and it hurt. She would not rush into Vaughn's arms and open herself up to that pain all over again if he got bored with her and Secret Valley and left, or if he died like Jonah had, or if Wesley Richens showed up and hurt them all. She never agreed when Vaughn asked if they could go to dinner, and she didn't offer for him to eat with them. It made her sad to think of him eating alone, but she refused to jump into another relationship. Though he teased her often, asked if she was impressed by something he did, or reminded her to breathe when he picked her up in basketball so Josh could make a shot. He was doing pretty good at not pushing her too hard or fast, and never demanded explanations about why she couldn't commit to him. Thanksgiving was in a few days. Should she invite Vaughn to come to dinner? That wouldn't be like a date, but more a neighborly thing to do, knowing he'd be by himself otherwise. His phone rang or beeped an incoming text often when they were together, and he'd told her about a few different friends. It seemed he was social, but not super close to anybody except a few lifelong buddies. It made her worry he had no place to go for Thanksgiving. If she invited him for dinner, was she only making an excuse of being neighborly when she truly wanted to spend more time with him? Savannah, Noah, and even her dad had teased her about him. But she insisted he was cute with Josh, which he really was. If they persisted, she'd admit he was fun to be around, which he really was. Savannah kept teasing that he was also super hot, which he really, truly was. She put Josh to bed and lay there thinking about when she'd wrapped her arms around Vaughn from behind to stop him from slamming the basketball that afternoon. He dropped the ball, pivoted, and pulled her close. She'd frozen, tingles and warmth rushing through her. Neither of them had moved until Josh demanded they play with him again. She smiled to herself just thinking about it. Vaughn was so much fun to be around, and she had to admit he'd been more than respectful of her request to take things slow and more than impressive around her and Josh. Maybe she was ready to accept a dinner invite or ask him to come to dinner at her house, maybe even Thanksgiving. She could only imagine how excited her dad, Noah, and Jason would be to spend time with him. They all chatted with him at church, but nobody except Savannah saw them interacting at the gym and knew she and Josh spent time with him a few afternoons every week. She'd sworn Savvy to secrecy and tried to explain her issues. Savannah understood, but that didn't stop her from nudging. A beep sounded on Allison's phone and she sat upright in bed, clutching the covers to her. That beep meant somebody or something was on her porch. During the day, the alerts got annoying, but at night they terrified her. So far, they'd never been anything scarier than the neighbor's cat, Rosemary. She liked the cat. Rosemary was friendly and ate mice regularly. She hated being woken up and investigating to find it was only Rosemary prowling round to find her dinner. Allison grabbed her phone and looked at it. Growing closer to and more comfortable with Vaughn, she'd also let her guard down about Wesley Richens, especially as he hadn't appeared in 6 weeks. She'd started shutting off the lights at night like she used to. With the porch lights off, she couldn't see as clearly as she'd like. But there was obviously a man creeping toward her front door, and he had something in his hands. Her heart seized in her chest. Instead of freezing like she was afraid she would, she sprang into action. She jumped out of bed, grabbed her bear spray, pulling off the safety plastic and clicking it into firing mode. Noah had tried to talk her into a small pistol instead of the bear spray, but she'd never be able to shoot someone with a bullet. She looked forward to shooting Wesley with her bear spray. She clutched the bear spray and her phone and ran out of her bedroom. She darted into Josh's doorframe, but he was sleeping soundly. Determination raced through her. If Wesley Richens was back, he would know not to mess with her or her family ever again. A face full of bear spray would not be out of line for that jerk. Running down the stairs, she held down the button on her phone and said, "Call 911. Emergency." The phone beeped and connected. 911, emergency. She reached the entryway. "There's an intruder on my porch," she said breathily, heart thumping so quick she could have been running sprints. "My address is 1911 Juniper Lane. I'm putting the phone in my pocket now to confront him. Please send somebody quick." The dispatcher protested, but she didn't care. She should call Noah, but there was no time. She was determined to scare the crap out of Wesley Richens and make him wish he was back in prison, and make certain he never bothered her or Savannah again. Shaking from head to toe, she flipped the lights on, ripped open the door, and yelled, "How dare you come back here, you jerkbait Sobe?" Sobe was a made-up swear word she and Savvy had created. It seemed fitting. She glanced around. Where had he gone? Pinpricks of unease crept up her spine. It was like those awful movies when the villain jumped out and sliced the heroine open with no warning. Please help, dear Lord above. She couldn't get sliced up. She had to protect Josh. Maybe coming outside to confront him wasn't smart, but she didn't want him to get away. She could not live in fear. She clung to the bear spray with trembling fingers. She would shoot him in the face with this entire can, and then he would go back to prison where he belonged for daring to come up on her property. The chilly night air bit at her legs and arms, but she ignored it. She edged out onto the porch and kicked something. Looking down, she saw a wrapped present. Josh was written in bold letters on the front. What in the world? Why would Wes give Josh a present? What was he playing at? Horror choked at her. What if it was a bomb? She slowly backed up into her house. Allie? A male voice came from the lawn. 20 feet off the porch and out of the circle of light. She aimed the bear spray in that direction. Don't move or I'll shoot. Allie, it's Vaughn. What? She let her arm relax, but called to him. There's a creeper around here. Be careful. This might be a bomb on my porch. Vaughn stepped into the circle of light. It's not a bomb. It's a present for Josh. I brought it over and was going to text you in the morning to have him find it, but I heard you yell before I got back inside. Are you okay? His green eyes were full of concern. Vaughn? she suddenly felt weak. It was you on my porch stripping the sensors? You didn't see anybody else? She tried to wrap her mind around it. Vaughn was the man she'd seen on the camera. He'd been bringing over a present for Josh. He gave her a soft look and asked, "Can I come up there, or will you empty that canister of bear spray on me?" She let out a sharp laugh and said, "I might shoot you just for scaring me." He chuckled, but his body and face were taut. He was worried about her. Striding to the sidewalk and then up the steps, he enfolded her in his arms. Allison jolted in surprise. They touched each other teasingly during basketball, but they weren't to the hugging stage. She didn't care. It felt amazing. Vaughn covered her with his strong body and lean arms, shielding her from the cold and her fear. She wanted to wrap her arms around his strong back, but she kept them tucked against her chest, leaned her head against his chest, and let him hold her. A vehicle raced into our circle drive. A vehicle with flashing lights. 2 men popped out and yelled, "Police! Hands up!" "Police!" Vaughn released her and turned around, shielding her with his body, putting his hands up. "It was a false alarm, guys," he said, all ease, confidence, and charm. "Sorry to waste your time." "Holy crap, it's Vaughn Tabane," one officer said. Allison peeked around his side. He was so big he could protect her from anyone, even the police if need be. "Mrs. Menendez," the dark-haired officer glared at his partner and then asked, "Is this your intruder?" She edged around to Vaughn's side. "I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. I called 911 because I saw a man on my porch, but it was Vaughn bringing my son a present. Please forgive me for the false alarm." The 2 men shared a look, then put their guns back in their holsters. The first one spoke into a radio. "False alarm. It's a code 4 here." "Sorry," Allison managed. The blonde cop nodded. "It happens." He looked at Vaughn. "Can I please get your autograph? My son is a huge fan. We'd heard you moved to the valley, but didn't believe we could get lucky enough to meet you." Vaughn smiled easily. "I've got a signed poster in my office. Just give me a minute and I'll grab it for you." "Oh, wow. He'd be stoked out of his mind. Thank you." Vaughn nodded. The dark-haired officer looked like he wanted to ask for a poster too, but he said nothing. Vaughn turned to Allison. "Can I please come back and talk to you for a minute?" Thrill and fear raced through her. He wanted to know why she'd reacted the way she had. Or maybe he wanted to be alone with her, in the dark, in her house. She'd kept him at arm's length, and hadn't even told him about her fears of losing someone else she'd loved, or of Wesley Richards being released. Something about that hug made her crave his protection and reassurance. She nodded. "I'll just be inside. I'll leave the door unlocked." With the police standing outside waiting for their poster, she'd be fine for a minute. "I'll be right back." He gently touched her face before jogging off the porch and across the lawn. Allison put a hand to her face where he'd touched her and watched him go. When she looked back at the policeman, embarrassment filled her. They studied her, as if wondering about her relationship with Vaughn, or in the dark-haired guy's case, checking out her legs. She shivered, and not just from the cold. "We know Noah and Savannah," the darker guy said. "You look just like her." "Thanks, they're great." "They are." He nodded, and then more silence. "Thank you for coming," she tried to say graciously. Sorry for the false alarm." "No problem, ma'am," the blonde guy said. "I'm getting a signed poster of Vaughn Tabane out of it." She nodded. "That is lucky." "You're the lucky one, being his neighbor, and he left a present for your son." Oh, she'd almost forgotten about that. She bent down and picked it up, waved, and backed into the house. As she did, she saw Vaughn running back. He carried 2 posters and a basketball. He gave her a reassuring smile, then ran up to the cops. "I thought you might both like a poster, and I found an extra signed ball. I hope your son likes them." "Wow," the blonde guy's eyes went wide. "Thank you so much. I'm saving these for Christmas." Vaughn handed over the paraphernalia. The blonde cop stuck his hand out, and Vaughn shook it. Then he shook hands with the dark-haired guy. They both thanked him again, then walked slowly to their car, as if not wanting to leave his presence. Allison understood. She loved being around him too. He turned and jogged up to the porch, following Allison into the house and locking the door behind him. Heat pulsed through her as she led him into the living room, and she wanted him to hug her again. She set the present down on the table and murmured, "Thank you. Josh will be excited." He smiled softly. "I know it's early for Christmas presents, but I couldn't resist." They settled down onto the couch, and she pulled her legs up and wrapped her arms around them. His gaze fitted over her legs, but he focused on her face. "Are you okay?" She nodded shortly. It was wrong to ask him to hold her close again. It would give him mixed signals. They were developing a great friendship, but she didn't need romance in her life right now. But oh, how she craved some romance with him, and she craved his touch and comfort even more. Her memories of Jonah and Ryan were far away. Her fear of Wesley was silly. Vaughn would protect her. Vaughn would never leave her. All she could see and feel was Vaughn. "What happened?" he asked. She blew out a breath. "I saw you on the cameras, and I thought you were an intruder." He nodded, but his eyes were far too perceptive. "I'm sure living alone can be unnerving, but it seemed like you were looking for a particular creeper." "Why do you say that?" "You yelled about, 'How dare you come back here, you jerkbait Sobe?' First of all, what does Sobe mean?" She smiled and ducked her head. "Savvy and I used to make up swear words when we were younger so we wouldn't get in trouble." He chuckled and gently brushed his fingers along her cheek. "You're so great." Allison trembled from his warm touch. She wanted another hug more than ever. He sobered. "Were you planning on a particular intruder? Is there a stalker I need to find and tear apart?" Allison looked at him. She learned to trust him because of his patience with her and kindness with Josh. It couldn't hurt to tell him about Wes, could it? She drew in a breath and explained. "Almost a year and a half ago, a man named Wesley Richens came to my house, tried to get me to sleep with him, and then chased me up the stairs when Josh called out." Vaughn's eyes widened, then narrowed. The muscles in his arms flexed. "He grabbed me and knocked me down the stairs, called 911, then ran. Short story is, I was in a coma. He paid a nurse to drug me to keep me there so he could make a play for Savannah, eventually kidnapping her because he thought she would love him where I had refused him. Something about us looking alike. But then he thought Savvy was his soulmate. So creepy." Vaughn blinked at her. "He sounds like a psycho. Isn't he in prison?" She hugged her legs tighter, fear tracing through her. "He was. But he got released early, shortly after you moved here." She looked away and admitted, "It was one of the reasons I tried to keep you at arm's length." Vaughn softly touched her arm. She turned to look at him. "Do you still want me at arm's length?" Allison drew in a shuddering breath. "I don't know if I ever wanted you at arm's length. I just knew I had to take things slow. I've been through a lot of heartache losing my mom and Jonah, dumping Ryan, and then knowing Wesley could come back." He nodded. "I know how it feels to lose someone you love." "I know you do." "I'd really like to not be at arm's length right now," he said softly. "I'd like to hold you and comfort you." Allison felt tears prick at her eyes, loving his concern, completely drawn to him. "Can I hold you?" he asked huskily. "Yes," she burst out, and then she scrambled onto his lap. Vaughn's face registered surprise at her quick reaction, but he quickly wrapped her up tight. "Thank you, Allie," he whispered against her hair. Allison cuddled into him, feeling safe, comfortable, warm, and trembling with the excitement of being in his perfect arms. He was almost a foot taller and twice her weight, but he didn't feel too big. He felt perfect. She laid her head against his powerful chest. Vaughn held her close, but he didn't make any moves on her. Something shifted in her. She wanted Vaughn close, wanted him in her life. After a few wonderful minutes of feeling so good she wanted to beg him to hold her all night, she made herself look up at him. "Thank you. I'd better go to bed and let you get home." He looked like it was the last thing he wanted to do, but he nodded and released his grip on her. She had so much respect for him in that moment. She slipped off his lap and Vaughn stood next to her. It always gave her a thrill to stand next to him. He was so big and manly that she felt instantly protected. At the moment, it was more than protection she felt. Now her interests were speeding past a simple hug. She wanted to kiss him and see if it would be as dynamic as she'd imagined. She ignored her own desire and walked with him to the foyer. He turned to her. "Noah doesn't think this Wesley Richens will come after you again?" "No, he doesn't. He'd go straight back to prison. He's a creep who thought me and then Savvy would fall in love with him and couldn't take no for an answer. But he's smart, too. Smart enough to keep me drugged without the police catching him. Smart enough to kidnap Savvy right under Noah's watch." It all made her shudder with fear. Wesley might not come after her, but he could imagine him paying someone to do his dirty work. At the same time, it had been 6 weeks and nothing had happened. Vaughn gave her a quick side hug. "I'm right close by if you need me, but you might have to give me your cell phone number." She laughed at that. They'd never exchanged numbers. He just always came over at 3 o'clock on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. He liked to tease her about it. She looked up at him and oh, how she wanted to give him a kiss of gratitude. Thank you. She nodded. He nodded and then pushed the door open to leave. She didn't want him to leave, but that was crazy. She was safe in her house, and she and Vaughn weren't even dating. He'd been incredible about taking things slowly. The cold air filtered in quickly. Vaughn looked back at her. Do you want me to stay? He asked seriously. Then his eyes widened as he realized what he'd said. I would sleep on the couch. I just want you to feel safe. She did want him to stay, but it wasn't happening. Ryan had stayed in the guest room almost every weekend, but she hadn't been attracted to him or had any risk of throwing herself at him. Vaughn's broad, perfect chest and arms were so appealing she could never resist him if he stayed. Thank you for the offer, but I'll be fine. Okay. He looked torn, but he walked out the door. See you in the morning. Thanks, she said again. Any time. The look in his green eyes said he meant it. He'd protect her. He'd be here for her, anytime she needed or wanted. Her stomach hopped happily and filled with heat. Instead of flinging herself at him, she shut the door, impressed by her own self-restraint. She deadbolted the door and checked the alarms and sensors. A few minutes later, she was back in bed. She thought she'd be terrified to go to sleep, but as she drifted off, she wasn't thinking about Wesley, Jonah, or Ryan. She was thinking about Vaughn holding her so tenderly, and she couldn't stop wondering if this was going to change their relationship. Instead of being afraid or cautious, she found herself hoping it would. Chapter 9. Vaughn woke early the next morning and ran in a cold 25 degrees. Snow dusted the mountains, but so far it hadn't stuck in the valley. He couldn't stop thinking about Allison, how protective he'd felt of her last night, how much he wanted to find and thump that Wesley idiot, and how incredible it had been to simply hold Allison. How would she act today? Would she shut off from him again, or would she finally give him a chance? It felt like something had shifted between them last night, but he'd been honoring her request to take things slowly and didn't let his hopes get too high. Thanksgiving was in 2 days, and he wanted to spend it with her and Josh. A few friends had invited him to Southern Cal for Thanksgiving with them and their families, but she didn't want to leave Secret Valley on the off chance that Allison would invite him. He didn't want to be alone on Thanksgiving, but it was more than loneliness that made him want to spend every day with Allison and Josh. He wanted them in his life. He couldn't think of anything he wanted more. He got to the gym right on time and waited to open her car door. He'd suggested they ride together, but she hadn't taken the bait yet. She smiled up at him so sweetly, his heart started racing. Was this it? Maybe she would finally let him take her to dinner, let him date her, let him be more a part of her and Josh's life. She'd been true to her word the past 6 weeks. He'd had a couple of hours with them a few afternoons each week. But it wasn't enough for him. Not nearly enough. Vaughn! Josh hollered from the back seat. Vaughn wanted to have a minute with his buddy's beautiful mother, but he couldn't deny Josh. He waited for Allison to slide out of the car, shut her door, and then hurried to get Josh's door. Josh had already undone all his buckles, and he jumped into his arms. I love my present, he yelled. You're the best. I love you. Josh squeezed him tight around the neck, and Vaughn lit up inside. He'd forgotten about the present in the midst of everything else that had happened last night. Josh had told Vaughn he loved him often over the past 6 weeks, and it made him ecstatic every time. He hadn't felt true love since his parents had died almost a year ago. Tylee's fake love had proven what a great actress she was. It should have broken his heart, but it had been a fast burn for him, and a desperate grab to be loved and a part of a family after losing his parents so suddenly. He didn't miss or feel bad about Tylee. He was simply relieved to be away from her. You're welcome, buddy. He looked slyly at Allison. Do you think we should have a laser tag war in my basement instead of basketball today? Yes, please. Josh clapped his little hands together. They walked into the gym together. Vaughn held the door for Allison and then walked her to the daycare. Her sister spotted them and gave them a big wave and a smirky smile. How much did Allison's family know about her spending time with Vaughn? He saw them at church each week, and sometimes coming in or out of her house in the evenings. It felt like they had this circle that he wanted entry into, like a teenager left out of the cool kids club. But he cautioned himself not to push too hard. He didn't want Allison to shut him out completely. They walked down the hall to the daycare, while Josh prattled about how he would beat them both at laser tag. and how he played it with his papa and Ryan at the fun center and beat them both. Whenever Josh said Ryan's name, it stung a little, but he never seemed sad that he didn't see the guy any longer. Ryan hadn't shown up in the past 6 weeks, or at least, not that Vaughn had seen at least. Vaughn prayed harder that he could slide into that guy's spot. Actually, he wanted more than that. When he took Allison to a fancy dinner and asked her to marry him while she wore that red dress, he wanted her to scream, yes, as cute as she had last night when he'd asked if he could hold her and she jumped into his arms. That was a memory he'd never forget. And again, he was getting far ahead of himself. Tyler had asked him to marry her after dating for a month. They'd flown the Grand Cayman, been married as quick as they could arrange it, and it had been a huge mistake. Tyler and Allison were polar opposites, and Allison had no reason to put on a show with him. She was as unpretentious and flawless as any woman he'd ever been around. She might have been over Ryan, who she hadn't seemed to love, but maybe she wasn't over her husband. Losing a spouse was traumatic. He had to respect her wishes if she still wanted him to proceed slowly. Allison signed Josh into the daycare, and the little boy slid out of Vaughn's arms and ran to be with his friends. Vaughn took liberties he hadn't at the gym previously, and put his hand on Allison's lower back as he directed her out into the hallway. As soon as they were away from the open door of the daycare, but far from where anyone in the weight room could see them, he stopped and turned to her. Did you sleep okay? She smiled up at him, so sweet, so trusting. Thanks to you. His eyebrows rose. I didn't stay. But you made me feel safe, and I thought about you instead of Wesley Richens. Heat filled his chest, and he leaned in closer. Ellie. His voice went deep and husky. We need to talk. About? Something that will benefit Josh. Her dark eyes had a sparkle in them that boded very well for him. And suddenly he thought of an agreement that she might accept, but hopefully wouldn't push her too fast and make her shut him out. What are you thinking? He swallowed and plunged in. I agreed to practice with the high school basketball team, and they're switching to afternoons instead of morning now that football's over and their season is officially starting. Her shoulders lowered and disappointment filled her eyes. Oh, okay. I'll tell Josh something. How about we come up with a Christmas pact to keep Josh happy? A Christmas pact? He nodded. For the next month, we spend every evening and weekend together like we're in a romantic relationship. She stiffened. For Josh, he rushed to add. Mostly it's for Josh. We make it an incredible holiday season, and Christmas for Josh. And for Vaughn. But his selfish idea of being boyfriend and girlfriend hadn't gone over as well as he'd hoped. If he told her his parents had died shortly before Christmas, would she take pity on him? He probably knew that, as big of a deal as the media had made about his lackluster performance for a few weeks after that. Luckily, with a lot of prayer and help from above, he'd been able to keep excelling at basketball, even if he made the stupid decision to marry Tylee. And you give me this trial run of our Christmas pact time. Trial run? She arched an eyebrow. What happens after the trial run and Christmas? Well, he rested his arm on the wall and moved closer, and saw her pulse thrum in her neck. He wanted to tease her to breathe, but she seemed to be breathing, very quickly. We'll reevaluate again. If it's going well, and I manage to impress you with my boyfriend skills as well as I have my basketball skills, he pumped his eyebrows, we could make the relationship more permanent. She froze. Or we can reevaluate, he said quickly, praying during the next month he could get her to trust him, kiss her each night after Josh was in bed, and make her fall in love with him. She drew in a breath and looked over his face. I guess we could try it. Yes. He wanted to punch a fist in the air, but he wanted to kiss her more. Was that pushing too fast? He leaned down, and to his extreme joy, she arched up, her lips soft, her eyes warm and welcoming. Whoa, excuse me. A voice came from the hallway where a young mom held a toddler's hand. Vaughn's disappointment almost choked him, but he turned with a smile. Excuse us. The woman swayed on her feet and grinned at him. Any time. Hi, Bree, Allison said. Oh, Allie, I didn't even see you there. I noticed. Bree's face flamed red. Sorry, friend. I shouldn't tease you. Vaughn's smile does that to me, too. She looked up at Vaughn with a sweet smile of her own, and his heart threatened to burst out of his chest. Did she mean it? Bree laughed. This is my friend Vaughn, Allison said. I know who he is, Bree smiled. I'm Bree Hendry. Nice to meet you. You as well. Bree walked past with her little girl, turning to smile at him. Vaughn took Allison's hand, planning to walk into the gym together. She stopped and looked up at him. So the Christmas pact gives you other liberties. Liberties? He cocked an eyebrow, liking the sound of that. She raised their clasped hands. Holding hands. She tilted her head back to the spot he'd almost kissed her. Not a very romantic spot for a first kiss. He'd have to do better. Leaning in for a kiss? She looked a little flushed herself. He squeezed her hand. I like the idea. Let's make it part of the pact. Like hot cocoa and sledding. Great Christmas activities. He winked. We'll see. She looked a little rattled as they walked toward the gym, but she didn't take her hand from his. He counted that as a win. Chapter 10. The next couple weeks were incredible, but passed much too quickly. Vaughn felt like a part of the family at Thanksgiving, and loved getting to know Allison's dad, Noah, Savannah, Jason, and Brittany. He and Allison spent their evenings and weekends together, playing ball and laser tag, but also doing all kinds of fun Christmas activities, including decorating trees at both of their houses. Hers was much prettier, but she was much prettier, so it fit. When he told her that, she smiled and ducked her head, sadly not kissing him for the compliment. No matter what they did, Josh was with them. He loved spending time with Josh. He also wanted to get Josh's incredible mother alone and kiss her long and deep. They held hands sometimes, and he always got a hug goodnight from both of them, but he hadn't broken through the barrier of staying after she put Josh to bed. It was mid-December, and the snow was piling up in Secret Valley. Instead of basketball or laser tag, they'd taken Josh sledding after Vaughn got done with practice. Josh loved his laser tag set and basketball games almost as much as airsoft wars. After sledding, they made dinner and cookies together. Vaughn was ecstatically happy at Allison's house with the two of them. Her home was 10 times the size and opulence of the home he grew up in, but in every other way it was similar to his parents' home. Warm, comfortable, happy, safe, religious, but with the added thrill of smiling at, teasing with, and sometimes touching Allison. They played chutes and ladders, drank cocoa, and ate cookies by the fire while snow piled up outside. The tree and garland lights shone prettily. It was perfect. Vaughn felt like he was on a Hallmark card, and even better, like he had a family of his own. He appreciated his friends, but nothing was like a family. Even as an adult, it had gouged him deep to lose his parents. What would happen with him and Allison after Christmas when they reevaluated their pact? He prayed she would let him talk her into officially dating, or even better, being engaged. He'd promised himself to take it slow, for her and for him. He did not want a repeat of Tylee. Yet how could that be possible with someone as great as Allison? Bedtime, Josh, Allison said when Vaughn won the game. Oh no, Josh groaned. Vaughn smiled at the cute little man, knew that was his cue to go home. He'd see them in the morning. He hated going home to his quiet, empty, too big house. Maybe if he had one kiss to warm him, and the dream of more kisses to come, it wouldn't be so hard. Can Vaughn sing me Jesus songs and say prayers? Josh asked. Vaughn froze, praying for a positive response from Allison. The times Josh had asked before, she'd always said no. She said it nicely, but it was clear she was still drawing boundaries for him. He didn't blame her. She'd lost her mom and her husband. Vaughn knew how loss could affect a person. It had made him want to find that kind of deep, lasting relationship again, as evidenced by him rushing into the marriage with Tylee. But it made Allison reluctant. He didn't know how the 2 years of dating and sad breakup with Ryan played into it, but he hoped the guy still wasn't in her heart. Allison studied him for far too long. He braced himself for a no. Then she nodded. Okay. Yay, Josh cheered. Yay, Vaughn repeated. Allison laughed. You two. How can I resist either of you? Vaughn's eyes widened. She occasionally said things like that, making him think he had a chance. But mostly she focused on Josh and treated Vaughn like a friend. A good friend, but he wanted a lot more. You can't, Josh said. Come on, Vaughn. Vaughn stood and grabbed the hand Josh offered. It felt so right holding this little man's hand. They walked away together, and Vaughn heard a soft sigh from behind them. He glanced back. Allison was watching them with soft eyes, a hand over her heart. He grinned at her, and she seemed to catch her breath before returning a smile. Hers was a little hesitant, and he prayed to his parents up in heaven that he could break through her walls. He was in love with her and Josh, but afraid if he told her that truth, she'd shut him out again. At least tonight they would have a minute alone. He prayed even harder for the right words, and maybe a kiss. Was that out of line to pray for? Allison watched Vaughn and Josh walk away, hand in hand. She loved seeing the two of them together, the huge, tough man and her little, adorable boy. She let out a breathy sigh at the amazing picture they made. Vaughn looked back and grinned. She thought she might have a heart attack. How was he so appealing to her? Jonah had been shine and intensity, and she loved him deeply, but she never felt so comfortable and relaxed with Jonah as she did with Vaughn, even though they'd spent their years together. Jonah had loved her, but somehow she always felt like she was in his shadow. Interesting that a famous superstar made her feel like the most incredible person on earth. With Ryan, their relationship had been too comfortable. In 2 years and a lot of shared kisses, she'd never experienced the tingles and warmth and desire that Vaughn stirred in her, and he hadn't even kissed her yet. Was he the perfect fit for her? What about Josh? She had a hard time imagining any other man becoming Josh's father, and that was rushing things too fast. She returned Vaughn's irresistible smile, and they walked away. As soon as they were gone, fear filled her. The fear that had kept her from letting Vaughn put Josh to bed any other night. If she was alone with him, she would probably jump on his lap like she had the other night. She thought she had an intruder, but this time she would kiss him. Was she ready for that? Ready for a relationship? It wasn't just about letting go of the pain of losing her mom, Jonah, and Ryan, or the fear of falling for Vaughn and then losing him. It was about Josh as well. If things didn't work out with Vaughn, would Josh recover? He'd loved Ryan, but not like he did Vaughn. Since Vaughn had spent the evenings and weekends with them, Josh had stopped asking about Ryan completely. Allison jumped to her feet and hurried to clean up the dishes to keep herself busy, but sadly, her mind kept running. She finished too quickly and washed her hands, then rubbed some coconut lotion into her hands and neck. She sniffed her armpits. They smelled okay, but she rubbed some lotion there too for good measure. If only she could sneak upstairs, past Josh's room, and brush her teeth. But she popped in some gum and chewed it ferociously instead, standing by the garbage so she could spit it out as soon as she heard his footsteps. Her stomach hopped. She trusted Vaughn, or she would never let him be alone with Josh and do prayers and songs. Was the trust they developed over the past few months enough? Was she insane to jump into another relationship? Vaughn was a fun, charming, kind, successful, patient, and handsome man who seemed sincerely invested in her and her son. She was insane not to give this a chance. The pain of past losses hit her. She didn't know if she'd survive losing Vaughn. He was quickly becoming important to her, second only to Josh. How had she let herself fall so quickly? It had only been 2.5 months since she'd broken up with Ryan, and Vaughn had smoothly worked his way into their lives and her heart. His Christmas pact was evidence of that. He knew she couldn't turn him down if it benefited Josh. Yet what if it hurt Josh in the long run? Vaughn might get bored of their quiet valley and leave. He might get bored of them. They played games a toddler liked. How could she and Josh compare to the exciting lifestyle he'd led in California and with his career? How could she compare to Tylee Hammond? Yet Vaughn seemed to think she and Josh were incredible. He told her he'd never had much of a childhood, always playing basketball or working to save money for basketball. He seemed to enjoy the carefree time and games they played. Maybe he wouldn't leave them, but he could easily die. She hated death. It robbed her of so much. His footsteps sounded on the stairs. She opened the garbage drawer and spit out her gum, slid it closed, and then walked back toward the couch, trying to act like she hadn't been waiting for him. He came out of the foyer and into the living area. His face lit up and his green eyes were happy. I love that kid. She smiled, pushing her worries aside. He loves you too. Vaughn paused as if testing the waters. I'd like to stay longer tonight. With you. She pressed her lips together, prayed for help, and then nodded. His smile lit her up all the way through. He slowly approached, letting her appreciate every beautiful inch of his long, lean body and his handsome face with those unique green eyes. He was the most appealing man she'd ever encountered in real life, but he was so much more than his outside appeal. How do you fight off the women? She asked, as he sank into the couch next to her. He turned to her, a look of surprise on his sculpted features. Because I'm a celebrity? She blushed and looked away. I think your celebrity status has very little to do with how appealing you are and why every woman wants you." Silence reigned for a few beats. Then Vaughn eased closer, slid his arm around her shoulders, and gently turned her to face him. Her heart raced at the heated look in his eyes. "Ellie," he murmured, "I don't care if any other woman wants me. I only care about you." She studied his green eyes and longed to kiss him. "It's not a question of me wanting you," she tried to explain. The desire in his eyes faded a bit. "What is it a question of?" She tried to think how to explain. "I'm scared," she finally admitted. "Of me?" His eyes widened and filled with concern. "Allie, you have to know I would never hurt you or Josh. I would protect you with my dying breath if you needed me to." Warmth filled her chest. She rested her hand on his muscular leg, and that warmth spread. "I know that, Vaughn. You are an honorable and good man. Thank you for that." She took a deep breath and pushed out. "I'm scared of losing you." He nodded, serious. "I understand. We've both lost parents, and that was devastating. I can't imagine how it was to lose your husband and Josh's father." "It was horrible," she admitted. "My dad and Savvy were there for me, but nobody can replace a spouse or my son's father." She felt the muscles in Vaughn's leg flex under her palm, and his arm muscles tightened around her shoulder. He stared at her and quietly said, "I have no idea what to say to that. Is that why you're so cautious about developing anything with me? You think I'll try to replace Jonah?" She had no idea how to explain. "Maybe, but there's also fear of something happening to you." "I'm tough," he said. "That's obvious, but sometimes being tough doesn't ensure safety. Jonah had been strong too, but not strong enough to survive a plane crash. There's also the guilt." "Guilt?" His brow squiggled. She nodded. "I adored my husband, and in my own way I loved Ryan, even though I couldn't have married him, but I've never been so impressed or attracted to anyone as I am with you." She said it, put it out there, and oddly the guilt wasn't as debilitating when she spoke the words aloud. Vaughn's eyes flashed with happiness at her words. He pulled her a fraction closer. "Ellie, I don't want to replace Jonah or ask you to forget him. You loved him and were married to him. I want to create new memories with you, and hopefully you can find room for me in your heart too." He was moving fast again. He hadn't said the word love regarding himself, but the look in his eyes said he wanted to. Allison was tired, not physically, but emotionally. She was sick of the guilt over forgetting Jonah and Ryan, the stress of raising Josh by herself and worrying she wouldn't do the best thing for him. The battle of worrying something would happen to someone else she loved, and most of all, keeping herself from Vaughn. She wanted a break from all of it, and she wanted to be in his arms. Throwing caution to the wind, she licked her lips and said, "I can think of one new memory I'd like to create with you." Vaughn's eyes immediately lit up, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. His arm around her shoulders urged her closer. "You name it, and I'll impress you." His kiss would blow any other kiss out of the water. She blinked up at him, wondering if she'd have to spell it out. She wrapped her hands around his neck. "I feel silly asking. I think you know what I want." He smiled. "Do you remember the night I put the present on your porch and scared you?" "Yes." "That night, I asked if I could hold you, and you were so cute when you screamed yes and scrambled onto my lap." The heat of desire mingled with embarrassment at her impetuousness. Vaughn, telling her she was cute, wasn't quite exactly how she wanted him to view her. "I'd love to reenact that and raise the stakes a little." "How so?" she asked. She longed to scramble onto his lap again, and this time she wasn't afraid thinking of Wesley Richens. She was more than ready to feel Vaughn's appealing lips on hers. "Ellie," Vaughn's voice was deep and husky, and the look in his eyes thrilled her. "Can I kiss you?" Allie grinned and yelled probably too loudly, "Yes!" And then she scrambled onto his lap. Vaughn chuckled, wrapped his arms securely around her. His strength and large frame surrounded her. Her breath rushed out as he bent his head close to hers. "You're so cute." She blinked up at him. "I want to be more than cute to you, Vaughn." "Oh, you are," he promised. He gently kissed her cheek and murmured, "Beautiful." He kissed her cheek again, moving fractionally closer to her lips, and her breath caught and held. Enticing. He kissed the side of her mouth. She thought she'd pass out from the sheer pleasure of having him so close, The anticipation of wanting his mouth on hers, incredible. He was a breath away. She clung to him, urging him closer. Vaughn smiled and his lips brushed hers. Breathe. Allison let out a shaky breath and laughed. You have no idea what you do to me. Oh, I do. The teasing in his voice was gone. If it's anything close to what you've done to me, it's all-encompassing and overwhelming. You're perfect to me, Allie. She knew she was. His words filled her with light, joy, and love. He slowly eased closer, and the anticipation about killed her, but she loved it. He finally placed a lingering kiss on her lips. Allie clung to him, not needing to breathe, and not worried about anything for the first time in years. She returned his kiss with all the desire, appreciation, and maybe even love for him that had been building inside of her. His answering kiss made her feel like the most treasured woman in the world. She'd been right. Kissing Vaughn was more incredible than anything she'd experienced in her life. Vaughn may have been a superstar on the basketball court, but that was nothing compared to his expertise at making Allison feel treasured and loved. She was definitely impressed, and she never wanted to let him go. Chapter 11. The next morning, Allison still felt like she was floating. Vaughn's kisses were incredible, but she was even more grateful for his sweet words. Could this be real? Could this be lasting? Only time could tell. But for now, she pushed the fears away and decided she would enjoy this time. Vaughn was the epitome of health. He didn't fly anywhere for work, and he most likely would not die from cancer. If his kisses and the kindness and devotion he showed her and Josh were any indicator, no one and nothing could pull him away from them. He knocked on their door a little before 9 a.m. the next morning. Allison rushed to the door, but Josh beat her there. Vaughn, he cried out, flinging himself at him. Vaughn scooped him up, and Josh wrapped his little arms around his neck. What you doing? Your mama said we could ride to the gym together today. He gave her a wink. Allison flushed. Was she letting this progress too quickly? Vaughn and his Christmas pact meant they'd been together almost non-stop. How could she slow this down when all she wanted was to be close to him? Yay! Shall we go through the garage and pick up his car seat? Allison asked. Vaughn stared at her and looked chagrined. I ordered the same car seat so we wouldn't have to move yours when I drive. It came yesterday. Allison's eyebrows rose. Too fast? Vaughn asked. She shook her head. She knew he had plenty of money, so the car seat wasn't a big deal to him. But it was a big deal to her. He was thoughtful, and a car seat in a famous NBA basketball star's expensive sport utility vehicle spoke of commitment. Their Christmas pact was a little silly, but it had allowed her to let down her guard and let him into their lives and her heart. Christmas would come quickly, and then they'd reevaluate. Would she be ready to make a commitment to him? How could she resist? That was really thoughtful of you, she said. He smiled, looking relieved, and helped Josh with his coat while she shrugged into hers. They walked together to his car. The drive to the gym passed quickly, but she couldn't shake the feeling of them being like a family. Josh chattered in the back seat, Vaughn holding her hand while he drove with his left hand, him glancing at her often and giving her his irresistible smile. Was this it? Would she commit herself to him? Now she was the one moving too fast. A series of incredible kisses didn't mean they were committed. He got her door at the gym, gave her a quick kiss that warmed her clear through before opening the rear door and lifting Josh out of the back seat. They walked into the gym together, as they had many mornings, but today felt different. She glanced up at her tall, handsome friend. Maybe more than a friend. He smiled down at her with a twinkle in his green eyes. There was a sparkle of promise and hope between them. She savored it. They dropped Josh off and walked in the weight room and cardio room hand in hand. Savannah saw them and lit up. Luckily she was with a client, so she couldn't tease them. They went their separate ways to lift, and Allison didn't like the separation. That was silly. She kept catching his eye, and he'd grin at her, and something would pass between them. Kissing had changed their relationship in an incredible way. She could hardly wait for tonight. She was so focused on Vaughn that she didn't see the tall, dark-haired man approach her. She was on the Smith cable machine. It had 2 cables, so a person could use both, or 2 people could use the machine at once. She was doing tricep pull-downs with the rope on one side. Care if I use the other cable? The man asked. That's fine, Allison said, barely looking at the man before resuming her exercise. You look amazing, Allie, the man murmured. Allison jerked her gaze up to him, and her jaw dropped. Unease crawled up her spine and made her skin prickle, and she clung to the ropes with shaking hands. Wesley Richens? How dare he approach her? You get away from me, she hissed, releasing the cable and backing up. He released the bar and held up his hands. His handsome face distorted in a leering smile. Hey, no hard feelings, beautiful. I spent over a year in prison for you, but I won't hold that against you. Her eyes widened. A year and 3 months in prison hadn't changed him at all. He still thought he was a gift to the world, had a warped view of reality, and was never in the wrong. I have plenty of hard feelings for you, she shot back at him. If you come near me or Savannah, Noah will beat you worse than he did when you kidnapped Savannah. He blanched at Noah's name, but covered it with a smooth smile. Noah's not here right now. Her heart thudded faster. Noah wasn't, but Vaughn would protect her if she called for him. Wes wouldn't dare hurt her in the gym in front of all these people, but knowing that he held no remorse and just seeing him made her heart race with panic. She was more certain than ever that he'd show up at night when she was alone. Noah's not here right now, but I am. Vaughn's smooth voice came from right behind Allison. She whirled and wrapped her arms around his waist. He pulled her in tight, and she was immediately safe. Wes couldn't touch her. Vaughn would protect her. But what about later when she and Josh were alone? Wes's eyebrows rose. Obviously, he hadn't expected Vaughn. Vaughn's size alone would intimidate most people. Who are you, and why are you talking to my girlfriend? Vaughn demanded. Allison tried to slow Vaughn down with their relationship, but right now she loved the title and the possessiveness in his voice. Calm down, man, Wes said. I was only talking to her. It's Wesley Richens, Allison whispered into Vaughn's neck. Vaughn's body tightened against her, and his green eyes shot fire. If you so much as look at her again, I will thrash you within an inch of death. The confident threat surprised Allison. You wouldn't dare, Wes snarled. My dad and I own this valley, and my dad is the governor. Vaughn chuckled darkly. You little weasel. I'm Vaughn Tabane. I'm untouchable by you and your father in every way. He let who he was sink in. Allison didn't want to look at Wes's face, but she snuck a glance and saw it rattled him. She'd never seen a hint of Vaughn throwing around his status or his strength, but he was obviously flaunting both right now, and she was thrilled. I heard you moved into the valley after you failed at basketball, and Tylee Hammond dumped you, Wes threw at Vaughn. Vaughn laughed coldly. You stay away from Allie and Savvy, or it will be a race to see who rips you apart first, me or Noah. Wes's eyes widened again. He recoiled, but he didn't run. He simply retreated a couple steps. His face was determined, though, and Allison knew he wouldn't play fair. He obviously still thought he was untouchable, and wanted to win above all else. She and Savannah may have been the only women who'd refused the handsome, rich, spoiled Joe, and he flipped out because of it. Vaughn kept one arm around her and directed her away from Wes. She thought he might come after them, but he didn't. She looked around, but thankfully Savannah was not in the weight room. Allison would be shaking and crying, but with Vaughn here, she felt safe. They made it to the hallway by the daycare, and he turned her in her arms and held her close. His huge frame sheltered her, and his powerful muscles were perfect to cling to. He pressed a kiss on her forehead, and his voice was tender, a complete contrast to how harsh it had been while he spoke to Wes. Are you all right, sweetheart? She trembled as she clung to him, shocked that Wes would dare approach her, and terrified that he was every bit the jerk he had always been. Where was Savannah? Allison hadn't seen her in the gym for a few minutes. She prayed Wes wouldn't find her sister. She and Vaughn should go back out there, find Savannah, and protect her. But first, she had to ask, Can you fight? He chortled. What? You threatened to thrash him, and I love that you did. It's obvious how strong you are, but you're a basketball player. Not an ex-detective like Noah or Jason who have been trained to fight. And honestly, you're like the nicest guy I've ever met. It's hard to picture you throwing a punch. Vaughn's smile grew smug. Oh, sweetheart, I grew up in downtown LA. My daddy might have been a preacher, but he taught me how to fight. If not, they would have killed me the first day of kindergarten. Kindergarten? Her eyes widened. There was still so much she didn't know about him. He nodded. You have any idea how bullies like to beat up the younger kid who's gangly and tall for his age? Oh, Vaughn. She hugged him tighter. I'm so sorry they hurt you. He chuckled. Sorry, I should have said tried to beat up. I'm super tough, love, and I know how to fight. I fought my way through school, and I always won. Allison felt warm all over. This man could and would protect her, and he just called her love. Forget going slow. She wanted Vaughn holding her close, always. Chapter 12. The next week passed quickly, with lots of time spent with Vaughn. Allison faked brave and refused to let anyone stay at her house, but she slept with all the alarms set and bear spray in hand. Noah and Jason had committed all their friends in the sheriff's department to monitor Wes and watch over both of their houses. Vaughn's assurances that he could and would protect her helped her more than her bear spray. She was tempted to let him sleep in her guest room. Wes had been reminded via Allison's lawyer that he had to stay at least 300 feet away from Savannah and Allison. Neither of them had seen him in the past week. Luckily, Savannah hadn't seen him that day at the gym. She'd been in the trainer's office filling out a health questionnaire with a new client. It was only a few days before Christmas, and Allison and Vaughn were at a sledding party with their church group. Vaughn had been working with the youth group at church and the high school basketball team, so it seemed every teenager stopped to talk to them. Their eyes lit up, probably in awe from his superstar status, but Vaughn treated them like old friends. Savannah grabbed Josh's hand. Do you want to sled with Noah and I this time, big guy? Yeah, sure, Josh exclaimed. He waved goodbye and trotted off with Savannah. Noah held a huge tube in one hand, but he swept Josh off his feet with the other and progressed up the hill. Josh laughed happily. Vaughn arched his eyebrows at her. Do you want to go down together? Warmth filled her despite the cold biting at her cheeks. Yeah, sure. Vaughn chuckled and gave her a quick hug. You are irresistible, you know that? She smiled. Wesley Richens? Who cared about that jerk when she had Vaughn by her side? Vaughn hefted her inner tube. It wasn't as huge as Noah's, and Vaughn was bigger than even her tough brother-in-law. How would they fit on it together? Allison's imagination took off, and she had some exciting ideas. There you two are. Where's Josh? Her dad and Vaughn shook hands. Good to see you. You too, sir. Josh went with Noah and Savannah. Ah, I see. He looked them over, and the glint in his dark eyes made her feel like a teenager caught sneaking out with the basketball star. You'll be with us for Christmas, right, Vaughn? Allison should have given her dad a hard time about inviting someone to her home, but she felt warm inside. Her dad approved of Vaughn and wanted him with them. Who wouldn't want Vaughn around? She wanted more and more time with him. Did she dare suggest their Christmas pact become a boyfriend and girlfriend pact? Or even better, an engagement pact? She shivered. Was she ready for that? I'd be honored to, sir, Vaughn said. He towered over her dad and was a grown, successful, famous man, but he was still so respectful. She'd seen that in him whenever they were around someone older than them. He was kind to everyone, though. A true Christian in her mind. It was impressive. Her dad smiled and clapped him on the arm. How about Frank instead of sir? Thank you, Frank. Her dad gave her a quick hug and strode off to the enormous bonfire and refreshment table where his friends were congregated. Savannah and Allison were always watching to see if he treated any of the older, single ladies different, but so far he hadn't shown any interest in dating. She'd love for him to find someone special. Vaughn took her hand, holding on to the tube with the other, and they started climbing the hill along the designated hiking trail so a sledder wouldn't take them out. The further away from the fire they got, the darker it became. Stars twinkled in the midnight blue sky and reflected in the lake below. She wasn't a fan of the cold, but Secret Valley was beautiful. She loved it here. What were you thanking my dad for? Permission to not call him sir? Vaughn shrugged. Not really. It seemed like he was giving me permission to be with you. Allison squeezed his hand. I think my family are huge Vaughn Tabane fans. He laughed. Your family's great, but I'm mostly concerned about one member of that family being a fan and impressed with me. A tube whooshed by them. Even in the semi-dark, she could see Noah, Savannah, and Josh loaded on it and hear their joyful whoops. She and Vaughn kept walking to the top. A knot of people stood at the crest of the sledding hill, waiting their turn. She tugged Vaughn off to the side in a copse of trees and turned to face him. I am impressed with you, Vaughn, she said, staring up into his handsome face, sharp angles softer in the night sky. His eyes looked dark brown, not green. He set the tube down and slid his arms around her, tugging her close. You are? She loved that this huge, tough, famous, handsome man sounded a little uncertain, as if he needed her reassurance. She slid her hand up his muscular arms, and she felt him tremble under her touch. It was a thrill to be alone with him here in the dark. I'm impressed with you for being so patient and fun with Josh. That's easy. Josh is the best. She smiled, feeling emotion well within her. Everyone liked Josh, but Vaughn and her son had an extra special bond. I'm impressed with how respectful you are around older people and kind to everyone else. The only person she'd seen him be unkind to was Wesley Richens. She wholeheartedly appreciated his harshness with that nightmare. My mama would have beat me if I wasn't respectful and kind. His voice was tender. She knew he'd adored his parents and missed them horribly. I'm impressed that you aren't cocky about your superstar status. You're surprisingly humble despite how handsome and successful you are. You wouldn't have liked me as a teenager. I picked fights with everybody and was the cockiest jerk you'd ever meet. She laughed. Somehow I doubt I could have ever not liked you. Maybe you would have fought for me. Of course, and I would have won. She lifted onto her tiptoes and softly kissed his jawline. I'm impressed with your superior kissing ability. He gently cupped her face with one of his large palms, leaned down and kissed her long and slow and deep. Allison filled with warmth. The chilly wind, Wesley coming after her, her fears of losing Vaughn, her worries over raising Josh right, and not hurting him if this relationship failed. Nothing could touch her in Vaughn's arms. The kisses slowed, and he cradled her close. There is one more thing that impresses me, Allison said. There was actually a long list, but she wanted to get back to the kissing. Oh? Your bicep and chest. I have to admit they're extremely impressive. Vaughn laughed low and deep. Thank you, Allie. Is it my turn to list all your impressive characteristics? Later, she murmured. Right now, Noah and Savvy have Josh, and I want to keep kissing you. He laughed, and then he was kissing her. When they finally broke apart and moved back to the line to sled down the hill, he asked in a low voice, Am I moving too fast? Allison glanced up at him, and she knew. She was falling in love with him. It might be too fast, but she couldn't stop it, and she didn't want to. Not at all. He grinned and he kissed her right next to the crowd. Somebody whistled, and then a snowball hit Allison in the arm. She forced herself to break from Vaughn's kiss and glare at whoever threw the snowball. Savannah was grinning, holding another one. Getting a little hot for a church activity, aren't you? The people around them laughed. Josh ran and her at Vaughn. I sled with you this time, he declared. Okay. Vaughn laid the tube down and sprawled out on top of it. Allie, you first, then Josh on top. Allison was certain they'd all be killed, but she couldn't resist Vaughn. She laid back against his chest. He was so big that she felt comfortable and stable. Josh jumped on top of her, and her breath whooshed out. Vaughn put his arms around both of them and whispered in her ear, I've got you. Allison smiled. I know you do. Someone pushed them from behind, and they all let out whoops as they gained speed and flew down the hill. Vaughn had her. She would be safe from Wesley Richens and her silly fear of losing Vaughn, and she would never be alone again. Chapter 13. Allison ran around her kitchen on Christmas Eve. Savannah and Noah had taken Josh ice skating so she could get everything ready. Her dad was bringing the pies, and Savannah was bringing the appetizers and veggies, but the ham, turkey, sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes, and rolls were all on her. She preferred doing it and enjoyed cooking. Vaughn had been helping earlier, stilling kisses, testing meat, and chopping potatoes. He'd gone home to shower and would be right back over to carve the turkey. Allison had taken a break to freshen up, change into a red sweater and black pants. But now she had to put the finishing touches on everything before they all got here. Her house was gorgeous, with pine boughs and lights strung everywhere. Her huge Christmas tree decorated by her, Vaughn, and Josh was pretty. It was prettier at night when she couldn't see the 3-year-old had directed where everything should go, and a 6'7" NBA star had hung ornaments up high and teased about his lack of decorating ability. She didn't care. She didn't want perfection. She wanted more memories with Josh and Vaughn. The doorbell rang. Allison blinked in surprise and wiped her hands on a towel. Her family would come through the back door, and Jason and Brittany were in Arizona with his parents. It had to be Vaughn or a neighbor bringing a treat by. She put on some lip gloss from a nearby drawer, then hurried out of the kitchen and into the entryway. She pulled the door open with a huge grin. Ryan? He grinned broadly at her. Allie, wow, you look gorgeous. Thanks so much for sending the card and invite. Invite? Card? What was he talking about? Ryan stepped onto the threshold, wrapped her in his arms, and kissed her. Allison pulled back, flushed and confused. Rye, what are you doing? He held her close, his arms like an iron grip. I've missed you so much, Allie. Allison had missed him too, as a friend. She heard the garage door opening and closing, and finally pulled out of Ryan's grasp. How could she tell him that she was dating Vaughn, and had no idea what card he was talking about? He looked so happy being here, and she hated to hurt him again, but it would be super awkward when Vaughn came. Footsteps came into the foyer, and then she heard shouts of, Rye! Allison's stomach churned. Ryan squeezed her arm, then hurried to pick up Josh and hold him close. Oh no, this was a nightmare. Josh had forgotten all about Ryan the past couple months. But would they be right back to crying for him at night? Where was Vaughn? The cold air was seeping into her house, so she stepped back and closed the door. Vaughn would be here soon. They'd get through the awkwardness. If Ryan stayed for dinner, that was his choice. But suddenly Christmas Eve didn't seem so thrilling. Allison hurried past Ryan, who was talking animatedly with Josh, Savannah, and Noah. She'd deal with dinner, and when Vaughn came, they'd present a united front. It would hurt Ryan again, which she hated, but somehow they'd get through this. She would not lose Vaughn. Vaughn carried a sausage and cheese platter he'd picked up earlier today in one hand, and fingered the ring in his pocket with the other. Was he insane to ask Allison to marry him tonight? She might tell him to slow down, but he didn't think she'd reject him like he had that Ryan guy. He'd picked up the ring from the jeweler yesterday before basketball practice, and then gone to talk to her dad. Frank had been welcoming and supportive, but warned him Allison had suffered a lot of loss, and he'd have Noah thump Vaughn if he'd hurt his daughter. Vaughn had smiled, and promised he would only love and cherish her, if she said yes. Vaughn walked out his front door into the cold, and felt as nervous as he used to before a big game. He would wait to propose until after dinner and Christmas Eve festivities. After everyone else went home and they tucked Josh into bed with 4 songs, he smiled, loving how the little boy begged him for more songs each night, and how he giggled when Vaughn sang silly ones. When the party was done and it was just him and Allison by the tree, he'd ask. She would scream yes so beautifully, and then scramble onto his lap. They might lose the ring in the kissing session that would follow, but they'd find it, and Christmas morning he'd wake up to the prospect of a family. Not just any family, Allison and Josh. He loved them more than anything on this earth, and could hardly wait to be Allison's husband and Josh's dad. His nerves ramped up as he strode down his driveway, along the sidewalk in front of their houses. There was no more cutting across the lawn, as the snow piled higher than he could have imagined. 3 feet and counting. He loved it. He loved even more the sight of the snowman in the yard that he, Allison, and Josh had made, and the lights of her house spilling out, welcoming him in. Would they sell his house and live in hers? Or would they sell both and make a fresh start? She hadn't talked much about the memories of Jonah in the house. He didn't want to compete with her deceased husband, but he wanted her to love him completely. He was so distracted that it startled him when he saw a dark-haired man illuminated under the lights of her front porch, and then Allison swung the door wide open. Vaughn was in the shadows between streetlights, and her house lights didn't reach him out here, but he could see her and the man clear as day. Too clear. Allison sounded surprised when she said, Ryan? Then the man Vaughn thought she'd sent packing wrapped her up and kissed her. Allison pulled back from the kiss quickly, but she could hear Ryan say something about a card and an invite, saying he missed her. She asked what he was doing, and Vaughn took that as a good sign. He couldn't clearly see her face behind Ryan's form. He wished he could see if she wanted the guy here, or if she was confused. Why in the world had she sent her ex-boyfriend a card and an invitation? Maybe she felt bad for him. Shouts of "Rye" came from inside, and Vaughn's gut twisted. That was his Josh, shouting for another guy. Ryan disappeared into the foyer. Allison stood for a moment, and Vaughn could see her beautiful face. It did look concerned. He started forward, but she shut the door. Vaughn froze. Out in the cold, alone. He wanted to storm into the house, pull Allison close, and kiss her hard on the mouth. Assert his dominance over this Ryan joker. Had Allison invited her ex-boyfriend? Did she want him to be a part of their Christmas? Could Vaughn play nice until the guy left? He'd worked hard since his cocksure high school and college days to be a nice, friendly Christian, and not a jerk athlete who thought he was above others and had to always be the alpha male. He'd always had an insatiable appetite to win on the court and tried not to let that spill into his personal life. His parents had trained him to be righteous and kind, and he relied heavily on help from above to keep him humble. Allison, he had to be with her. This was the one time he absolutely had to win. His heart thumped hard and fast, and the cold bit at his face and hands. He peered through the large kitchen windows, and he could see Ryan holding Josh, and the rest of the family congregated around him, talking excitedly. Allison was pulling rolls out of the oven, but as soon as she set them down, Ryan pulled her in with one arm while still holding Josh. Fear, competitiveness, jealousy, and anger all rolled in his gut. That was his place. That idiot was taking his place. Vaughn should storm in there, but he didn't trust himself. The need to win at all costs was overruling everything. He might act like a complete jerk and ruin the trust and love he and Allison built over the past few months. When he'd seen Ryan devastated at the restaurant after that failed proposal, he'd felt bad for the guy. The way Ryan had so gently escorted Allison out of the restaurant, not showing any anger, had made Vaughn think he was a kind man. In fact, it had reminded him of his own father, who had rarely gotten angry. Was it right that he wanted to plant a fist in that nice guy's face? It definitely wasn't Christian, as his father had worked so hard to instill in him. A tough principle to teach a cocky athlete. All he'd wanted to do when he was younger was play basketball, fight, and be the top dog. All he wanted now was Allison. Vaughn fought a battle within himself as questions rolled through his mind. Why had Allison invited Ryan? Did she love Vaughn? She'd never said love, not yet. Attraction, yeah, she'd said that and shown it a lot. Did she feel guilty for the guy being devastated a few months ago? Knew he was alone for Christmas and invited him? What if she wanted Ryan back in her life? Maybe it was Vaughn who had the charity invite. She'd strung Ryan along for 2 years and only broken up with him when he pushed her to get married. The ring sat heavy in his pocket. If he asked her to marry him, would she dump him too? He needed some time to think this all out and calm down, or he'd make a jerk of himself and probably injure Ryan. That wouldn't be good for anybody. Vaughn stalked back to his house, slamming the platter on the counter and pacing for a while. His heart ached for Allison, for Josh. All he wanted to do was be with them. The pain reminded him of when he'd lost his parents. The only thing that had saved him then was prayer. His dad would want him to pray now. The pain was so great that sinking onto his knees was actually a relief. He prayed desperately, for Allison, for Josh, for himself, even for Ryan. Please help me to see clearly and not hurt anyone physically or emotionally. He prayed over and over again. He felt better as he prayed, and when he was calm, he knew what he had to do. Chapter 14. Allison focused on dinner preparations and eased away from Ryan every time he tried to get close. She kept a smile on her face, but her gut was churning. She wanted to demand to know what invite Ryan was talking about. But far more important, she wanted to know where Vaughn was. He was never late. She should text or call, but she needed some space and fresh air. Her perfectly planned dinner was going to get cold, dry out, or get overcooked. But she couldn't care less at the moment. I'm going to walk over and get Vaughn, she announced. Everyone turned to look at her. Savannah winked at her, and Noah and her dad smiled approvingly. They all loved Ryan, but they loved Vaughn too. She could tell they knew who the right guy for her was. Vaughn! Josh yelled happily. Ryan's brow squiggled. Who's Vaughn? Vaughn's the best, Josh told him. Ryan's dark eyes dimmed. Allison had to face this head on, but she didn't want to humiliate Ryan in front of a crowd like last time. Not that it was her fault, as he'd chosen to ask her to marry him in a public place, but it had still happened, and she could have somehow stopped their relationship before the proposal. Hindsight was 20/20. If only she knew what to say right now to make it hurt less. Ryan was a great guy. He just wasn't her great guy. Will you walk me to the front door? She asked Ryan. Ryan nodded and handed Josh over to Noah, who immediately tossed him in the air to his peals of laughter and begging of, again. Allison walked stiffly next to Ryan into the foyer, praying their voices wouldn't carry. Ryan, I'm so sorry, she began. There was no way around it, so she ripped off the Band-Aid. Vaughn is my boyfriend. His brows rose and he said stiffly, You didn't waste any time moving on. She couldn't lie to him. I've fallen in love with him and feel he's the right man for me and for Josh." He shook his head. "It's been 3 months, Allie. We dated for 2 years. You dated Jonah for 5, correct? How can you trust someone after 3 months?" She felt bad for him, but he deserved to know. "I just know it's right. I'm sorry." He blew out a breath. "Why'd you send me that card saying you and Josh miss me and the invite to Christmas Eve dinner?" "I have no idea what you're talking about." She lifted her hands. "I didn't send any card." His shoulders lowered once again. He was in an extremely awkward spot. She hated it for him, but didn't know how to make it better. He started for the door. "I'd better go." "No." She put her hand on his arm. "Stay. I don't want you alone on Christmas Eve." He blinked at her. "I've tried over the past few months to forget about you and move on. It hasn't happened yet. I don't know that I'm strong enough to watch you be with another man." "I understand, and I'm so sorry this happened. Why don't you at least say goodbye to everyone, and I'll go get Vaughn. We'll give you time to leave before we come back." "Thanks. Can I give you one more hug goodbye?" "Sure." She went into his arms. It was familiar. It wasn't one bit exhilarating. Vaughn's arms were the perfect fit for her. Vaughn himself was the perfect fit for her. She would tell him she'd fallen in love with him. Tonight. She was stronger than her fear of losing him. Forget the Christmas pact. She wanted to be with him now and always, this Christmas and as many to come as possible. She pulled back and gave Ryan one more smile, which he returned, but he was tinged with sadness. "You're going to find somebody amazing, Rye. You're kind, successful, handsome, and an incredible man. Just not the right incredible man for you." "I'm sorry it didn't work." What else was she supposed to say? What else was she supposed to say? He looked over her face for a heartbreaking moment. Then he simply nodded, turned, and strode into the living area. Allison let out a breath, and for some reason thought of the times Vaughn had teased her to breathe. She smiled. It stunk saying goodbye to Ryan again and dredging up more pain for both of them. But it had only solidified how much she loved Vaughn and believed she'd found the right man for her. She pushed out the front door and shut it tight behind her, then hurried across her porch, down her steps, and across the sidewalk towards Vaughn's house. The cold bit at her cheeks, and she hugged herself for warmth, upping her pace. There was a black truck she didn't recognize in front of Vaughn's house. She passed it quickly, a little uneasy as it was a shadowy spot between the streetlights here and the lights from Vaughn's front porch didn't illuminate this far. Anticipation of seeing and kissing Vaughn filled her as she cleared the truck and started walking up his sidewalk. Almost there. Strong arms wrapped around from behind her and lifted her off her feet, dragging her back. "Vaughn?" The man stopped and spun her to face him. Her heart raced as her stomach dropped out. "Wes!" she gasped out through her horror. He grinned at her. And finally, we're alone again. "What are you doing?" she demanded, trying to pull away, but he was too strong. "Did you like your ex showing up and ticking off your new boyfriend?" Her jaw dropped. "You did that? You found Ryan's address and sent him a card?" He hadn't ticked off her new boyfriend. Vaughn hadn't seen Ryan, had he? He nodded, grinning as if he was the smartest man on earth. "I did a little research, and you should know I always win, Allison. You and your sister were too stupid to see what I was offering you. Now the offer of happiness is gone, and I'm going to hurt you and everybody you love." Ice pricked at her spine. She tried to yank herself free, screaming, "Vaughn!" Wes clapped his hand over her mouth and crushed her against his chest. She kicked and fought, but she was no match for his strength. "I'm going to have my fun with you, kill you, and hurry back to my dad's mansion before they finish the appetizers," he said calmly. She struggled against him and tried to bite his hand, headbutt him, and kick him in the shins. "I paid someone to plant evidence that it was Vaughn Tabane who killed you in a jealous rage, and everyone at my dad's dinner party can verify I was there all evening, except for when I was in the restroom with some stomach trouble. Your stupid Vaughn is sitting in his house moping because he saw you hugging your ex. He has no alibi." Allison's eyes widened. Vaughn had seen her hugging Ryan? Had that hurt him? It was crazy that was what she was worried about, when Wes would hurt and then kill her. If Vaughn was sitting in his living room at the rear of his house, he wouldn't have heard her scream, and her family were so busy talking with Ryan, they probably hadn't heard. She prayed desperately for help. "It's all going to work out more brilliantly than you can imagine," he grinned. "Let's do this, pretty lady." He knocked her feet out from under her and slammed her on the cold concrete walkway. Her back took the brunt of the blow, but her head hit hard. Dizziness and horror filled her, but Wes's hand left her mouth briefly, and she screamed, "Help!" before Wes dropped onto her, cutting off her oxygen supply with his large frame and pressing his gloved hand over her mouth again. He cautioned, "I have to do this right so they blame Vaughn. You can't go screaming like that." Allison prayed like she never prayed before. She had to fight, though she'd never wanted to inflict pain on someone. She felt justified when she clawed at Wes's face and neck with her fingernails. She bucked her body and kicked him. He howled and pulled her hands away, freeing up her mouth again. "Vaughn!" she screamed out. Wes pushed his mouth against hers, not kissing her, but pushing to cut off her scream and her oxygen supply. He pinned her hands under his body and ripped her sweater up. He fought hard, but she was no match for his strength. He would rape and then kill her. She had worried that Vaughn would leave her, but it was her who'd do the leaving. It must have been a premonition, not just her unreasonable fear of losing someone else she loved. Vaughn, Josh. She ached to hold both of them one more time and tell them how much she loved them. It would devastate her dad and Savannah. They'd already lost a wife, a mother, and a son-in-law, and her poor, sweet boy. He needed her. She fought harder than ever, freeing one hand and hitting Wes as hard as she could in the temple, then raking her fingers down his cheek. He howled and headbutted her. Blackness fought to overcome her vision. "I'm going to kill you first," he growled. "This will be much easier that way." "Vaughn!" she screamed again. Terror filled her. She didn't want to die, but if Wes really was going to take advantage of her, she'd rather be dead than endure something that horrific. Wes pressed his mouth against hers again. Footsteps thundered toward them, and hope filled her. "Vaughn? Noah?" Somebody had heard the screams. "You're not done with her yet?" A male voice she didn't recognize asked. "No." Wes pulled back from pressing his face against hers and muttered, "Keep watch, and then you can do your work." "Okay." The man backed away, behind the truck. "Help!" Allison screamed. Wes backhanded her, and she cried out. He wrapped his hands around her neck and squeezed. Allison clawed at his hands, kicked and writhed. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. Footsteps thudded on concrete. Allison felt a spark of hope, but things were dark and blurry, and her neck and lungs hurt. She would die before whoever was coming got there. If it even was someone coming to help her, it could be another one of Wes's cronies. Wes cursed and called, "Mike, help!" Wes's weight disappeared, and Allison gasped for air. "Allie?" Vaughn's voice was full of concern. He was leaning over her, his face swimming in and out of focus. She put a hand to her throat and tried to pull oxygen into her starving lungs. Wes came at Vaughn from the side. Allison tried to yell a warning. Only a squeak came out. Vaughn spun and slammed a fist into Wes's face, stopping him flat. Somehow Wes stayed on his feet, but Vaughn hammered him with hits to the face and drove him back against the truck. The other man, Mike apparently, came at Vaughn from behind and cheap-shotted him in the kidneys. Vaughn looked at Mike as if he were an annoying bug. Vaughn knocked Wes to the ground with a vicious punch to the jaw and then turned to Mike. He punched the man and Mike doubled over, gasping. Vaughn hit him under the chin, flinging him back into the truck. Something glittered in the dim light from the streetlights. Knife. Allison tried to cry out, but her voice wouldn't work. Chills made her body shake, more than the fear of Vaughn being hurt. Vaughn rolled his eyes, did an awesome karate chop thing on the guy's arm, and Mike howled in pain, dropping the knife. Allison clambered to her knees, pulling in air and holding her throat. It hurt, but her vision was clearing. "Mike!" Wes snarled, climbing to his feet. "Get him!" "My arm!" the guy whimpered. Wes cursed at him, but he didn't have time to say much, as Vaughn hit him repeatedly in the torso and face. He swung back, but his hits didn't seem to faze Vaughn. Allison remembered him telling her he could fight. He'd been right. He could fight better than anyone she'd ever seen, Noah included. Wes slid to the ground, and Vaughn dove on top of him. Then Vaughn's body bucked and shuddered as the crackle of electricity filled the air. Allison squeaked in horror. Did Wes have a taser? Finally, the awful tasing stopped. Vaughn shuddered, but didn't move off of Wes. Allison saw the glint of metal in Wes's hand. "Vaughn," she cried out. It came out as an agonizing squeak. Wes jabbed the knife into Vaughn's side, raked it down, and pulled it out. Vaughn grunted and tried to reach for the knife as blood poured from his side. "No!" Allison screamed, her voice a little stronger now. Mike still cradled his arm, but he shuffled over and kicked at Vaughn's bloody side. "No!" Allison struggled to her feet. Wes drove the knife into Vaughn's back. He was going to kill him. Allison yanked at Mike's hurt arm, and he spun away from Vaughn and shoved her into the snow, but at least he stopped kicking Vaughn. Wes's knife protruded from Vaughn's back, and Allison watched in horror as Vaughn went limp on top of Wes. "No!" she cried out. "Please, Father above, let him live." It was only a whisper, and her faith was so faint she didn't know if it had any chance of helping him. Mike came her direction, and he kicked her hard in the leg. It hurt, but she could only think of Vaughn. Was he already dead? Please, please let him live. Her front door opened, and she heard footsteps, normal, not running footsteps. It must be Ryan leaving. "Help!" she screamed as loud as she could. Agony ripped through her throat, but she needed Noah badly. "Noah! Noah!" She heard her call repeated by Ryan. His footsteps pounded in her direction. "Allie!" Mike took off. Seconds later, Ryan reached her, and a motor fired up down the street. "Allie?" "Vaughn," she begged. "Help him." Ryan helped her to her feet and turned to look at Vaughn. Wes was struggling to get out from under him, but Vaughn was not moving, and that awful knife protruded from his back. Noah and her dad raced up to them. "Call 911, Noah commanded her dad, who yanked out his phone and dialed as Noah dropped next to Vaughn. "He has a pulse." Allison caught a breath. He wasn't dead. She watched as Noah ripped off his own shirt and pressed it against the blood pouring from Vaughn's side. Allison could hardly stand looking at Vaughn's still form and that knife protruding out of him. "Can you pull that knife out?" she begged. "No." Noah shook his head. "He'd lose more blood, and I'd cause more damage." Wes struggled to push Vaughn off. "You lay still, or I'll beat you worse than I did a year ago," Noah threatened in a growl. Wes stopped moving immediately, panting for air and cursing softly. "And shut up," Noah warned. Noah leaned in, and Allison thought he was checking Vaughn's breathing. She held her breath. "Breathe, please breathe." "He's breathing," Noah reported. Allison prayed with more faith than before. If the EMTs could hurry, maybe he'd survive. Ryan paced in front of her, looking frustrated at his helplessness. Allison felt more than helpless. Her dad had been talking quickly to the dispatcher, but he came close and wrapped his arm around her. "Savvy's got Josh inside," he told her. "The EMTs will be here soon. It'll be okay." Allison was grateful Josh and Savannah didn't have to see this, but terror filled her, choking out the faith. Vaughn didn't move, and suddenly Ryan cursed and demanded, "Ryan, Frank, he stopped breathing. We've got to get him into a position where I can give breaths and not disturb that knife wound." Ryan and her dad hurried to do Noah's bidding. Noah threatened Wes not to move, and miraculously he didn't. Allison was frozen to the icy sidewalk, watching helplessly as they positioned Vaughn on his side and held him so Noah could give him life-saving oxygen. Vaughn wasn't breathing. Vaughn wasn't breathing. "Please help. Somebody in heaven above. I can't lose him. I can't lose another person I love. Breathe, Vaughn. Please, please, Vaughn. Breathe." Chapter 15. Allison paced the hospital waiting room, chewing off her fingernails. Her dad, Noah, and the pastor all waited with her, but she could hardly focus on anything they said. Savannah had Josh at the house, and Ryan was there with them. Jason and Brittany had called from Arizona, and all she could remember about that conversation was begging them to pray and them promising they were. Noah had pulled some strings because of his connections with the sheriff's office and gotten an update on the surgery. It wasn't going well. The knife wound in his side was deep and long and was the reason he'd passed out. He'd lost far too much blood, and being tased and having a knife stuck in his back hadn't helped. They'd given him a blood transfusion and were hopeful between that and Noah's rescue breathing that there wouldn't be brain damage. The knife wound to his back had nicked his pancreas and spleen, so they were trying to repair both. Hours later, she couldn't stop pacing and praying, but she wanted to collapse on the floor and bawl. Noah and her dad watched her with concern. Pastor Jameson had his head bowed, and she knew he was praying. It meant a lot, but she prayed hard for her mom and Jonah. Neither of them had survived. Vaughn told her how he'd prayed for his parents and still lost them too. She wanted to have faith and trust in Heavenly Father's will, not her own, but it was so dang hard. A couple exhausted-looking doctors appeared through the double doors that led to the emergency room. Mrs. DeBane? The female doctor asked. No, I'm not. We're not married, only dating. Oh. She exchanged a glance with her male counterpart. Does Mr. DeBane have family here? He has no family, she whispered. Her dad stood. We're his family. The doctor smiled slightly and said, Okay. She spread her hands and looked at the other doctor. He nodded at her. He's alive, but he's struggling. Allison sucked in a breath and wobbled on her feet. Her dad was there quick, wrapping his arm around her shoulder and holding her steady. The doctor's eyes filled with sympathy, but she continued. We sewed up the spleen and pancreas, but he lost a lot of blood. The rescue breathing helped, but there could be damage to his brain. Allison leaned into her dad. It'll be a matter of waiting and seeing. He could recover fully. He could have altered brain function. He could still slip away. She tried to say it gently, but Allison's heart hammered with fear. She could lose him. She thought getting him to the hospital meant he would survive. If he had brain damage, would he want to live? She didn't care. She would love him and be here for him. If only he could survive. Can I please be with him? She begged. The doctor glanced at her colleague. They had a silent exchange, and then the female doctor nodded and gave her an encouraging smile. Sometimes, in cases like this, it helps to have a loved one speak to the patient. If you'll scrub up, we'll allow you to sit by his bedside and talk to him as soon as they can get him situated in the ICU. Allison nodded. Thank you, she squeaked out. Her throat felt better than earlier, but it was still painful to get those words out. The doctors both nodded and turned away. Allison waited and waited some more. Her dad, Pastor Jameson, and Noah seemed a lot more patient than she did. They took turns comforting and praying with her. Finally, a nurse with short gray hair and a kind smile walked in the emergency waiting room. Her dad and Noah both lit up. Irene! Allison looked at the woman and recognition came. She'd been her nurse last year after Wes had attacked her. I'm so sorry you all have to see me again, Irene tisked. They all took turns hugging her, and then Irene took her hand. Let's get you set up to see your man. Allison let her lead her down a hallway, up some stairs, and down another hallway. They got buzzed into the ICU and walked past the nurse's station. They had her scrub up, and finally Irene walked her into Vaughn's room. Allison's gaze swept over his long form, laid out in a hospital bed that wasn't nearly big enough for him. His dark skin was too pale. He had an oxygen tube resting next to his nose, an IV, and a strange machine sucking out blood. What is that doing? She asked. Sucking out any extra fluid and blood around his internal organs from the knife wound. She patted his hand. Now you sit here and talk to him, and pray for him, and you let me know if I can do anything for you. Do you need some juice or water? She didn't want to need anything, but she admitted, Water would be nice. Thank you. Her throat was still raw. All right. I'll be right back. Irene gave her a kind smile and bustled off. Allison sank in the chair next to the bed and put her hand on Vaughn's arm. It was cool to the touch. She looked him over, terrified. Would he leave her like Jonah and her mom had? She closed her eyes, unable to stand, looking at him unmoving and so lifeless. Tears squeezed past her lashes and fell on his arm. She prayed desperately, but she didn't know if anyone was listening. Desperation filled her. She would lose him. She knew it. Sobs shook her shoulders, and more tears fell. The thought of praying terrified her right now. She knew how it would end. Even sitting by his side, spending these last moments with him was torture, since it was just a taste of what she was about to lose. All of her hard work trying to distance herself to prevent this exact thing from happening hadn't done her any good. All it had accomplished was depriving herself of time she could have had spent with him before he left her. Time she and Josh could have spent with him. A new intense wave of sobbing racked her body. A warm hand touched her shoulder, and she jerked her head up. Irene had a glass of water and an understanding smile. There now, sweet girl. It'll all work out the way it should. That's what Allison was terrified of. So far, that had meant loss and heartache for her again and again. Irene handed her the ice water. Allison wiped both eyes with a sleeve, then sucked some water down, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. She took a breath and muttered, Sorry I'm a mess. You're just fine. I want you to think about your man right now. He needs your prayers. He needs to hear your voice. I saw last year how strong and full of faith you and your family are. You've got this, sweet girl. She gave her one more smile and walked out, shutting the door softly behind her. Allison gulped. She was being selfish. Irene was right. She needed to stop thinking about her own fears and think about how she could help Vaughn. She mustered some strength and said a frantic prayer for help and strength. More importantly, recovery, desire to live, and strength for Vaughn. Then she gently stroked his arm and started talking. Hey, love, Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. I'm praying for you nonstop. I don't want you to leave me, but I don't want to be selfish. If you need to go be with your parents, and if that's God's will, I'll somehow survive. Would she really? Her heart would keep beating, and she'd live for Josh. Her faith in her family would somehow get her through. But if there's any way possible that you could stay with me, I will love and be devoted to you for life, and praise His name for letting us have a chance. I love you, Vaughn. I love you more than I ever thought I could love a man. Please, please, if it's possible, please stay with me. The tears choked her then, and she had to let them release on a shuddering sob, and take another drink of water before trying again. The words she spoke were similar, and she talked until her sore throat was raw. And then she'd take a drink, say another prayer, and try again. Vaughn never moved. He never responded, but she wouldn't give up. If God needed him like He needed her mom and Jonah, she'd somehow survive and not begrudge the Lord who had loved and sustained her through her losses. She'd somehow keep putting one foot in front of the other and a smile on her face for Josh. But if there was any chance, she prayed fervently for that, for Vaughn to survive, for them to love each other and to be together. Her faith was weak, but it was there. She kept talking and praying. It was all she could do. Chapter 16. Vaughn was floating. It was so strange. He felt no pain, though he could remember the excruciating feeling of electricity jolting through his body and then a knife ripping through his side. Now all he felt was light and happiness. Suddenly, his parents materialized not 20 feet away. Shocked, he tried to run but couldn't reach them. They smiled at him, looking proud and so full of love for him. Please, please let me hug them, he begged his father above. He didn't hear words, but felt an impression that someone else needed him. Then a voice seemed to penetrate his consciousness. It was Allison's voice. She was telling him she loved him, and begging for him to come back to her, and also saying that if he needed to leave, she'd somehow survive, but she'd never love again. Those words lasted for what felt like days, though somehow he experienced it all in a moment. His heart raced. She loved him. He wanted to tell her he loved her back, but he couldn't get the words out. Darkness wrapped around him, and he felt himself losing consciousness. Allie. He wanted to come back to her more than he wanted to hug his parents, but he didn't know how to get through the darkness and back to her side. Vaughn opened his eyes. He was no longer floating. It was dark, but lights blinked around him, and a soft whooshing sounded nearby. His body ached, especially his back and his side, but it was a dull ache, and everything felt fuzzy. Allie? He whispered. Allie? His heart thudded hard against his chest. Where was she? Where was he? His mouth tasted rotten, and his head felt too big for his body. Was Allie okay? The last thing he remembered before the weird visions of his parents and hearing Allie's voice was seeing that Wesley idiot choking her and then fighting him. The door burst open. Allie? He croaked again. A low chuckle sounded. Sorry, sweetie. The girl has been here around the clock, but her dad, sister, and I forced her to go eat something and lay down in an empty bed. I think she's passed out after being by your side for 2 days. 2 days? Your body started showing signs of improvement and stabilizing yesterday, and your brain function looked good, so we eased off the morphine and let you wake up. You aching? Yeah, he admitted. Aching for Allie. Okay, lover boy, calm down. Let's let her rest for a bit while I check you out and get the doc here. Oh, he flushed. If Allison had been sitting by her side for 2 days, he should let her sleep. Let her rest. You're right. The nurse smiled and took his blood pressure. I'm Irene, by the way. I was here the first night you came in, and I'll be here all night tonight for you. Nice to meet you. She took his oxygen and his temperature and then smiled. Let's get you some ice chips for that throat. Then we'll work up to heavy stuff like juice. She winked and patted his arm as if he were a small boy. I'll be right back. Vaughn laid there impatiently, shifting in the small, uncomfortable bed. When would Allie come back? Had she been here for 2 days because she loved him like she kept telling him in his dreams, or because she felt bad for him? Now that consciousness was fully returning, she remembered her hugging her ex-boyfriend. Was Ryan here in the hospital with her? Vaughn had been miserable at his house, trying to make sure he was calm and under control, when, in the midst of his prayers, he felt impressed to get to Allison's house. As soon as he'd headed toward his front entry, he'd heard her call for him. He'd hurried outside to investigate and found Wesley choking her. He'd gone into battle mode and couldn't remember most of the past fight. Most importantly, if Allison loved him, or if she wanted Ryan back in his life. Back in her life. Irene returned quickly and helped him spoon some ice chips into his mouth. Every movement hurt. "Do you want some painkillers?" He did. He really did. But he couldn't be fuzzy, and definitely couldn't go back under. He had to know if Allison could love him. He shook his head. "No, thank you." Irene looked him over. "You're as tough as you look. I used to watch all your games." "Thanks." He didn't want to talk about basketball. "Allie's really been in here for 2 days?" Irene nodded. "She's been whispering sweet nothings into your ear, hoping to wake you up." She smiled. "It's not actually true. She's been whispering meaningful love promises into your ear, hoping to wake you up." Vaughn's heart sped up. "Now calm down, lover boy. We don't need you excited after surgery and losing all that blood. Not to mention the worry you'd be brain dead." He wanted to hear everything that had happened, but he had to ask, "You think she loves me?" Irene chuckled. "I've rarely seen a woman that deeply in love. Yes, superstar, I know she loves you." Superstar. He could almost hear Allison teasing him with that term. He loved her so much. Suddenly he remembered everything went wrong before Christmas Eve. He'd been planning to ask her to marry him. "Irene, you have to help me." "If you'll stay calm." She gave him a stern look. "I'll stay calm." Could he really? His future was on the line here. "Where are my clothes?" She shrugged. "Probably in the trash. You most likely had to cut them off you when they brought you in." "Oh no. I had a diamond ring in my pants pocket." Her eyes widened. "Oh wow. Let me see if I can find them." "Thank you. But more importantly, can you help me brush my teeth, wash up, be presentable for when Allie wakes up and comes back?" She smiled. "You're more concerned about your teeth being brushed than losing a diamond ring?" He shrugged. It hurt. Any movement hurt. You might have to take those painkillers. The ring can be replaced. Making a good impression on Allie can't. Irene laughed. "Crazy rich people. I'll send some friends to look for your clothes and the ring, and I'll get you spiffed up for your girl." "Thank you. I owe you." She smiled and disappeared out the door. Vaughn was exhausted. He closed his eyes and prayed, and focused on what he'd say to Allison. Irene thought she loved him. He prayed he wouldn't flip her out if he asked her to marry him. If he didn't get the ring, he couldn't do that. But the most important thing was that he told her how much he loved her. Chapter 17. Allison woke feeling groggy, uncomfortable, and not quite sure where she was. The bed was small and hard, and the room was dark and chilly. She sat up with a start. Vaughn. Her dad, Irene, and Savannah had forced her to eat a salad from Costa Vida and lay down in this unused hospital room. She'd fallen asleep quick. How long had she been out? Vaughn had been showing great signs of improvement, but he still hadn't woken. It terrified her that he might not. She had to be by his side. She grabbed the bag Savannah had brought to the hospital for her, hurried into the bathroom, and changed into fresh clothes, brushed her teeth, put on minimal makeup, and sprayed her gardenia body splash. A shower and washing her hair would have been nice, but being by Vaughn's side was more important. She stuffed her dirty clothes and all the toiletries into the bag, then hurried from the room and down the hallway toward the ICU. The nurse must have recognized her, because she buzzed her in without Allison even saying anything. Allison thanked her and hurried towards Vaughn's room. Irene burst out the door. It was scary to see a nurse moving so fast. Was something wrong? Was Irene on her way to call a code red or something? "There you are." Irene hugged her blue eyes twinkling. "He's awake, sweetie." Allison's heart raced. She wanted to be there, but all that mattered was that he was awake. Heaven hadn't taken him from her. Sweet relief poured through her, and her knees were so weak she leaned onto Irene. "Oh, thank you, Lord." "That's right, love. We'll send up prayers of gratitude. But you go in there and see your man." She opened the door and ushered Allison through. Allison felt excited and apprehensive as she pushed around the privacy curtain and into the room. Vaughn's bed was inclined, and he sat partially up, supported by the bed. At the sound of her footsteps, his head turned toward her. "Allie," he breathed. His green eyes filled with love and desire, and she'd never been so happy. She hurried to his bedside and took his hand. "Are you hurting? Are you okay? I'm so happy you're awake." He smiled softly. "Me too. I hear you've been spending all your time in that uncomfortable chair." "It wasn't bad, and the view of your handsome face kept me plenty busy." She tried to be brave and not break down, and tell him how hard it had been, not knowing if he'd live or die, and if he did live, if he'd have brain damage. He chuckled softly, then grimaced. Allison leaned closer. "You're hurting? I won't make you laugh. Please don't move. They said you'd heal in a few weeks, but you'd have to be careful about lifting heavy objects." He smiled. "The only heavy object I want to lift is you." She wrinkled her nose at him. "That didn't come out right. You're not heavy. I want to lift you, or rather hold you close. Irene made me promise not to sit up or tug you onto this bed with me, though." She grinned. "All that matters is that you want to tug me onto the bed." "Oh, I do, love. I really do." "Love? I have some questions for you," he said. "Okay." She tried to remember the details of that horrible night, and what the doctor had told her about his injuries, recovery, and long-term care. He shocked her when he said, "Irene told me she heard you say repeatedly that you love me." Allison looked over his handsome face. "Love you?" she choked out. His face tightened, and concern filled his eyes. "Do you love me, Allie?" "Oh, Vaughn." She was going to make a fool of herself, but she didn't care. This was Vaughn. "I love you. I adore you. I don't know how I would have kept living without you." His smile came then, and it was like the sun parting the rain clouds. "I love you too, Allie." She ran her hands along his arm as they sat there staring at each other like two love-sick fools. "You should probably rest," she whispered. Now that they'd pledged their love, she could sit in this chair for many more days and wait for him to heal. She missed Josh horribly, but he was having a great time with her dad, Savannah, and Noah. They could reenact Christmas Eve and morning when she and Vaughn got home. Right now, she had to focus on Vaughn. Not yet. His eyes were determined, even though he looked exhausted, and he couldn't raise up to hold her close, kiss her, or tug her onto the bed with him. She arched an eyebrow. What could be more important than you resting and healing? He pulled his other hand out from underneath the sheet. A huge round diamond glistened at her. Allison's heart stuttered, then took off at a gallop to catch up. "Vaughn?" He looked her over. "I don't want to scare you away by moving too fast, Allie. But I love you. I adore you. And I don't know how I can live without you or Josh in my life." Allison sank into the chair, her legs unable to support her any longer. "I had this ring in my pocket when I walked over for Christmas Eve and saw you hugging Ryan." "Oh, you saw that? Oh, Vaughn, you know I didn't invite him and I only love you, right?" He nodded. "Thank you, Allie. I know that now, but that night I was a mess. I went back home and prayed and tried to talk myself out of storming into your house and knocking him out." Allison felt warm all over. She didn't want Vaughn to beat up Ryan, but she knew how fiercely he loved her. "I felt an impression to go to you, and as I walked through my entryway, I thought I heard you scream for me. I ran outside and saw that West jerk choking you." The awful feeling of West being on top of her rushed back, but she focused on Vaughn's face and said a prayer of gratitude. Vaughn was here. He would be all right. He was proposing to her. She should feel scared or apprehensive about getting married again, especially after almost losing him, but all she felt was happiness, gratitude, and love. "I remember fighting for you, but not much past that. The important thing is that you love me, and the Heavenly Father answered both of our prayers." He winked, and she felt a flush of joy. "Allie, I wish this was more romantic, and I could sweep you off your feet, but all I care about right now is knowing that we can be together. Will you marry me?" "Yes!" Allie screamed. She heard laughter outside, but she ignored it. She shot to her feet, and almost scrambled onto the bed next to him. "I don't want to hurt you." Vaughn groaned. "I've had visions of you climbing onto my lap after you screamed yes, just as cute as you did, but Irene threatened to keep me here for weeks if I moved or forced you onto the bed with me." Allison smiled. I'll climb onto your lap once you're healed. I look forward to that. His eyes glistened at her. For now, can you come close so I can put this ring on and kiss you? She nodded and extended her hand. He gently slid the ring on her finger and clasped her hand with his. He tugged her closer, and Allison bent down and kissed him. As their lips met, she knew she was exactly where she should be with the right man for her. The cheering in the hallway didn't interrupt their tender kisses, but Irene eventually came in and forced Allison to stand down unless she wanted to give the man a heart attack. Allison hated to stop kissing him. Vaughn would not only survive, he would be hers. She could impatiently wait for more kissing. Epilogue. It was a gorgeous 4th of July evening, and Allison's flowers were in full bloom. She walked critically around the yard, making sure not a weed dared to poke its head. She and Vaughn were hosting a barbecue for their close friends and family, and her dad had gone nuts buying fireworks for Josh. It would be a fun night, but she felt a touch of apprehension. Would Brittany's best friend, the famous model Izzy, and Ryan be mad at her for matchmaking them? Vaughn and Ryan had a tenuous friendship. It was still a touch awkward for both of them, but she appreciated them both trying. She and Vaughn had married March 26th and gone on a 2-week honeymoon to the Maldives. Vaughn knew he had nothing to worry about with Ryan and told her he would be friendly to the guy for her and Josh's sake. Warm arms encircled her waist, and she leaned back against her husband's muscular chest. Hi, handsome. He turned her around and kissed her soundly. Are you up for some sneaking around? She pumped her eyebrows. So we can make out instead of hosting the party? He chuckled. Now that sounds incredible, but I think you're going to want to see who your dad brought to the party. My dad brought someone? He wrapped his arm around her waist, and they carefully made their way toward the back patio, hiding behind trees and bushes, thinking they were hilarious. Noah, Savannah, Jason, Izzy, and Josh had been lounging on the patio couches, talking for a while and waiting for her dad and Ryan. All the food was ready, and Vaughn was planning to throw steaks on the grill when everyone got there. Savannah was hugging a woman with short gray hair, and Noah was talking with her dad. The lady pulled back with a bright smile, and Allison turned to Vaughn. Irene? She mouthed. Your dad brought her here, he whispered in her ear. As his date. What? She gasped. He cut off her exclamation with a lingering kiss, before they could go greet Irene and see if this was just a date, if there was more hope for their favorite nurse and her beloved dad. Footsteps came around from the side gate. Vaughn pulled her back and held her as they watched Ryan stride up to the group. Izzy's gorgeous face lit up. She was a vivacious brunette and a famous supermodel. She and Ryan would be a gorgeous couple. They'd met at Allison and Vaughn's wedding, and everybody claimed there was a spark. Allison watched closely as they greeted each other again, and even from here, she could see by their smiles and everyone else's responses that they were flirting pretty hard. She turned to Vaughn and squealed, I think we did it. He tugged her back to the flower garden, and they were encircled by fragrant blooms and blocked from the sun and everyone's view. Finally, you found someone for Ryan so he can move on. Can you blame him for wanting perfection? Vaughn chuckled, his deep, low laugh washing over her. No, love, I can't. I do have one question for you, though. Give it to me. She lit up, knowing what he would ask. His voice came up low and husky. Can I hold you? Yes, she called out happily, jumping into his arms. He wasn't sitting down, so she couldn't scramble onto his lap as she often did. He laughed, twirling her around and then holding her close as he kissed her very, very thoroughly. Are you impressed yet? Not with your superstar status, she teased, and grinned as he gave her a disappointed look, but definitely impressed with your kissing skills. That's all that really matters. He kissed her again, and she had to agree. His kissing skills were high on her list of his impressive talents, but the way he loved, protected, and enjoyed her and Josh were what really mattered. The end. This has been Christmas Pact, Secret Valley Romance, Book Number 3, by Cami Checketts. Copyright 2021, Birch River Publishing. Narrated by Denver Checketts.